Welcome, Midnight Wanderer. I'm your narrator tonight, here to lead you softly into a world where fear whispers your name. Before we start, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more haunting bedtime tales. Share in the comments where you're listening from and what hour your night began. And if you crave a specific horror story next, let me know. The blood on the windowsill was still tacky when I arrived at 6:47 a.m. on December the 26th, 2011. It hadn't frozen yet, which told me everything. Someone had been there less than 2 hours ago. The handprint was small, child-sized, pressed against the glass from the inside, fingers splayed in what looked like desperation. But the Jennings family didn't have children. They didn't have anyone anymore. I'm Detective Sarah Brennan, 23 years with the Colorado Springs Police Department, and I've worked hundreds of crime scenes. But that Christmas morning in the Woodland Park subdivision changed everything I thought I knew about human evil and institutional corruption. The snow outside the Jennings home was pristine except for a single set of boot prints leading from the back fence to the kitchen door. Size 12, deep treads, the kind hunters wear. They circled the house twice before approaching, like someone had been watching, waiting, choosing the perfect moment. Inside, Marcus and Diana Jennings lay in their bed upstairs. Not peaceful, not quick. The medical examiner would later confirm they'd been alive for most of it. Defensive wounds on their hands, ligature marks on their wrists where they'd been bound with what appeared to be Christmas ribbon. The expensive silk kind Diana had used to wrap presents just hours before. The ribbon was still knotted to the bedposts when I found them. Someone had made them watch each other die. But it was the living room that haunted me then and haunts me now. The Christmas tree was still lit, presents unopened beneath it. Stockings hung on the mantel, Diana's careful embroidery spelling out their names. And sitting in Marcus's favorite armchair, positioned perfectly to face the stairs, was a Santa suit. Empty, neatly folded, the beard laid across the arms like an offering. Beside it, a half-eaten plate of cookies and an empty glass that had held milk. We found Marcus's fingerprints on the glass. He'd poured it himself before going to bed, part of a Christmas Eve tradition his mother had started when he was a boy. Marcus Jennings was a federal prosecutor, 42 years old, specialized in organized crime cases. He'd just secured convictions against 6 members of the Volkov crime family, Russian mob operating out of Denver, running everything from drug distribution to human trafficking. The trial had concluded on December 18th, 2011, 7 days before Christmas, 7 days before someone entered his home and destroyed everything he loved. Diana was a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital Colorado, 38, known for taking extra shifts to cover colleagues during the holidays. Her mother told me Diana had volunteered to work Christmas Day, so a single mother on her unit could be home with her kids. She never made it to that shift. The first red flag appeared during the autopsy on December 27th. Dr. Chen, the medical examiner, called me directly. "Sarah, the tox screen on Diana Jennings came back. Rohypnol in her system, enough to incapacitate but not kill. But here's what's strange. There's also traces of it in Marcus's system. Someone drugged them both before." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Someone had wanted them conscious but helpless. Someone had wanted them to know exactly what was happening. I started pulling phone records, financial statements, anything that might give us a lead. That's when things got complicated. On December 28th, my lieutenant, Frank Morrison, called me into his office. He was sweating despite the winter cold outside, his face red and blotchy. "The Jennings case is being transferred to the FBI," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Federal prosecutor, possible organized crime connection. It's out of our hands." But I'd already found something. Marcus's office calendar, which I'd photographed at the scene, showed a meeting scheduled for December 23rd at 2:00 p.m. with someone identified only as VP. The notation beside it read, New evidence, prison testimony. I'd called Marcus's assistant, Jennifer, who confirmed the meeting had happened, but said Marcus had returned, looking shaken, and immediately locked several files in his personal safe. Files that weren't in the safe when we processed the scene. Jennifer also mentioned something strange. Marcus had asked her to make copies of everything related to the Volkov case and send them to an attorney in Seattle, someone named Robert Hayes. She'd done it on December 24th, Christmas Eve morning, just hours before Marcus died. I tracked down Hayes on December 29th. He confirmed receiving a package from Marcus, but said he hadn't opened it yet. It had arrived on December 27th, with instructions to open it only if something happened to Marcus or Diana. "I saw the news this morning," Hayes told me over the phone. "Jesus Christ, he knew. He fucking knew they were coming for him." I asked him to open the package immediately and tell me what was inside. He went quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, tight, frightened. "Detective Brennan, I can't discuss this with you. I've just become aware of attorney-client privilege issues. I'm sorry." That made no sense. Marcus was dead. Attorney-client privilege doesn't extend beyond death in criminal matters. Hayes was scared of something, or someone had already gotten to him. I called back 3 times. He stopped answering. On December 30th, I drove to the FBI field office in Denver to meet with the agents who'd taken over the case. Special Agent Victoria Reeves and her partner, Agent Kyle Morrison. No relation to my lieutenant, apparently. They were polite, professional, and completely stonewalled me. "We appreciate your initial work on the scene, Detective Brennan, but this is now a federal investigation. We can't share details about ongoing inquiries." I pressed them on the missing files from Marcus's safe, the mysterious VP meeting, the package sent to Robert Hayes. Agent Reeves's expression never changed. "We're aware of all relevant evidence and are pursuing appropriate leads. If we need assistance from local law enforcement, we'll reach out." That was it. I was dismissed. But as I was leaving, Agent Morrison followed me to the parking lot. He looked around nervously before speaking. "You seem like someone who actually gives a shit about finding who did this. Word of advice, let it go. Some cases don't want to be solved." Then he walked away. I couldn't let it go. On January 3rd, 2012, I contacted the Seattle Police Department and asked them to do a welfare check on Robert Hayes. They called me back 2 hours later. Hayes had been found dead in his office on December 31st, apparent suicide. Single gunshot wound to the head, his own weapon, no signs of forced entry or struggle. The package from Marcus Jennings was gone. Seattle PD seemed satisfied with the suicide ruling. I was not. I flew to Seattle on my own dime on January 5th and spoke to the detective who'd worked the scene, a veteran named Thomas Granger. He showed me the crime scene photos reluctantly. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. The gun was in Hayes's right hand, but his secretary told me he was left-handed. There was no blood spatter on his right sleeve, which there should have been given the angle of the wound. And the entry wound itself, I'm not a ballistics expert, but the angle looked wrong for a self-inflicted shot. I pointed this out to Detective Granger. He got defensive. "You're a Colorado detective working a different case." "This is Seattle jurisdiction. The medical examiner ruled it suicide. Are you questioning their professional judgment?" I said yes, actually I was. He asked me to leave. Back in Colorado, I started digging into VP Vadim Petrov, brother of Alexei Petrov, the head of the Volkov organization that Marcus had helped convict. Vadim had never been charged, insufficient evidence, the prosecutors said. But he was known to be the family's enforcer, the one who handled problems permanently. I found an interesting detail. Vadim had been released from questioning by Denver police on December 22nd, 2011. He'd been brought in for questioning related to an assault case. but the victim had refused to testify and charges were dropped. He was free and on the streets 2 days before Marcus's scheduled meeting, 3 days before the murders. I requested surveillance footage from the shopping center near Marcus's office for December 23rd. It took 2 weeks to get approval, but on January 20th, I finally saw it. There, clear as day, was Vadim Petrov entering the building at 1:55 p.m. and leaving at 2:47 p.m., right time frame for Marcus's meeting. So Marcus had met with the brother of the man he'd just helped convict. Why? What new evidence could Vadim have offered? And why would Marcus trust him enough to meet? I wrote up a detailed report and submitted it to my lieutenant on January 23rd, requesting authorization to bring Vadim Petrov in for questioning in connection with the Jennings murders. Morrison called me in the next morning. "Your request is denied. Furthermore, you're being reassigned effective immediately. Your new post is property crimes. Someone else will handle your active cases." I was being buried for asking the wrong questions. I tried going over his head to the captain. Captain Reynolds listened to my entire presentation, looked at my evidence, and then closed the folder. "Detective Brennan, you've done exemplary work for this department for over 2 decades. Don't ruin your career and your pension by pursuing conspiracy theories. The FBI is handling the Jennings case. You need to accept that and move on." When I objected, when I laid out the timeline and the evidence and the connections, he cut me off. "This conversation is over. Return to your new assignment or face suspension." I was effectively silenced, but I couldn't stop. I contacted the Department of Justice on February 1st, filed a formal complaint about obstruction of justice and requested an independent investigation. I never received a response. I reached out to journalists who covered organized crime. 2 showed initial interest, then stopped returning my calls. A third, a reporter named Emily Cortez with the Denver Post, met with me and reviewed my evidence. She was genuinely interested, said it looked like a major story. 2 days later, she called and said her editor had killed the story. "Insufficient corroboration," she explained, but I could hear the frustration in her voice. "Sarah, I believe you, but someone with a lot of power doesn't want this investigated. I'm sorry." On February 14th, 2012, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper after my shift. Simple message, block letters. Diana Jennings wouldn't stop asking questions either. Learn from her. I filed a report about the threat. It went nowhere. That same week, my daughter called me crying. She'd been accepted to Colorado State University's veterinary program, her dream school, but her financial aid had been mysteriously revoked due to what they called irregularities in our family's financial disclosure. Irregularities that didn't exist. I have copies of every document we submitted. Someone was punishing me through my child. The pressure increased. My mail was opened before I received it. My home was burglarized on March 3rd. Nothing valuable taken, but my home office was ransacked, and all my personal copies of the Jennings case files were gone. I'd been smart enough to keep backups in a safety deposit box at a bank in Boulder, but the message was clear. We can reach you anywhere. On March 15th, I was informed I was being investigated by Internal Affairs for allegedly accepting bribes from a suspect in an unrelated case. The allegation was fabricated, completely false, but it meant I was on administrative leave pending investigation. During my forced leave, I kept digging. I found out that Vadim Petrov had left the country on January 8, 2012, flew to Moscow and never returned. No arrest warrant was ever issued. No one tried to stop him. I also discovered that Special Agent Victoria Reeves, who'd taken over the Jennings case, had closed it on February 28th as unsolved pending new evidence. No suspects were ever publicly named. The case went cold by official standards less than 3 months after 2 people were brutally murdered in their own home on Christmas. The internal affairs investigation against me was dropped in May 2012 due to lack of evidence because there was no evidence. But my reputation was destroyed. Other detectives stopped partnering with me. Informants wouldn't talk to me. I was toxic. On June 1st, 2012, I was offered an early retirement package with full pension. The alternative, they made clear, was continued administrative duties until I qualified for normal retirement in 7 years. They wanted me gone. I took the package. I had no choice. I had my daughter's future to think about. But before I left, I made one final move. I took everything I had on the Jennings case: crime scene photos, autopsy reports, financial records, surveillance footage, witness statements, everything. And I sent copies to 3 different attorneys in 3 different states with instructions to release everything to the media if anything happened to me. Then I wrote a detailed summary of the entire case and the subsequent cover-up and sent it to every major news outlet I could find. Most ignored it. 2 published brief stories that went nowhere. The public didn't care about a dead prosecutor and his nurse wife. It was old news. It's been 13 years now. Marcus and Diana Jennings are still dead. Their families still have no justice, no answers, no closure. Vadim Petrov is still free, presumably living comfortably in Russia, untouchable. The files that Marcus sent to Robert Hayes, whatever evidence they contained, are gone forever. The people who murdered a federal prosecutor and his wife on Christmas, who staged it like some kind of sick, twisted mockery of Santa Claus coming down the chimney, faced no consequences. The system that should have protected the Jennings family, that should have investigated their murders properly, instead protected their killers. I'm 68 years old now. My daughter forgave me for the hell I put our family through, though it took years. She's a veterinarian in Oregon, successful and happy, and she doesn't like when I talk about this case. But I can't stop, because somewhere out there, someone knows exactly what happened in that house on Christmas Eve 2011. Someone knows who drugged Marcus and Diana Jennings, who bound them with Christmas ribbon, who made them suffer. Someone knows what evidence Marcus had discovered that made him so dangerous he had to die. Someone knows why the FBI closed the case, why I was silenced, why every attempt to find truth was crushed. If you have any information about the murders of Marcus and Diana Jennings, if you worked in the Denver FBI office in 2011-2012, if you knew Vadim Petrov or his organization, please come forward. Use encrypted communication. Protect yourself, but please, help me give their families the truth they deserve. Because justice may be dead, but the truth doesn't have to die with it. The morphine drip was running at 12 milligrams per hour when I checked it at 11:43 p.m. on December 24, 2015. When I returned to the room 18 minutes later, it was set at 48 milligrams per hour, enough to kill the 7-year-old boy in the bed within 2 hours. Someone had changed it while I was doing rounds on the other end of the pediatric ward. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone who wanted little Christopher Davis dead on Christmas morning. My name is Angela Torres, and I was a registered nurse at St. Vincent's Children's Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. Past tense for reasons that will become horrifyingly clear. I'd worked pediatric oncology for 16 years, and I'd seen children die. Too many children. Cancer is brutal and unfair. And sometimes, despite every intervention, despite every prayer, we lose them. But we don't murder them. We don't deliberately overdose them with pain medication and then falsify records to cover it up. At least I thought we didn't. Christopher Davis was admitted to our ward on November 2, 2015, with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. 7 years old, bright red hair, gap-toothed smile, absolutely obsessed with dinosaurs. He could name every species, tell you which period they lived in, debate the merits of various extinction theories. His mother, Patricia, was a single parent working 2 jobs to afford the treatments insurance wouldn't cover. Christopher's father had died 3 years earlier in a construction accident, leaving Patricia alone to fight this battle. And she fought hard. She was there every day, sleeping in the chair beside his bed, reading him stories, bringing in dinosaur books from the library. The initial prognosis wasn't great, but Christopher responded well to the first round of chemotherapy. By early December, his markers were improving. Dr. Raymond Foster, the attending oncologist, was cautiously optimistic. I remember him telling Patricia on December 10th that he thought Christopher might be strong enough for the more aggressive treatment protocol that could significantly improve his long-term survival odds. Patricia cried with relief. Christopher asked if the new treatment would make his hair grow back in time for second grade. We all laughed. There was hope. Then, on December 18th, everything changed. Dr. Foster called Patricia into his office for a private meeting. I wasn't privy to the conversation, but when Patricia emerged 35 minutes later, she looked destroyed. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. Christopher's grandmother, Ellen Davis, who had come to sit with Christopher during the meeting, tried to comfort her, but Patricia just kept saying, "I don't understand. I don't understand." I asked if everything was okay, if there was anything I could do. Patricia looked at me with hollow eyes and said, "Dr. Foster says the cancer has spread to Christopher's brain and spine. He says there's nothing more they can do. He's recommending hospice." This made no sense. Christopher's recent scans had shown improvement. There had been no indication of metastasis to the central nervous system. I'd reviewed his chart that very morning. Nothing suggested his condition had deteriorated so dramatically. I asked Patricia if I could see the new scan results. She said Dr. Foster had shown her images on his computer but hadn't printed them for her file yet. He'd said the formal report would be ready after Christmas. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Christopher was alert, playing with his dinosaur toys, asking when he could go home. He didn't look like a child in end-stage cancer progression. On December 20th, I approached Dr. Foster directly and asked to review Christopher's recent test results. He was irritated by my question. "Nurse Torres, I understand you've grown attached to the Davis boy, but questioning my medical judgment is inappropriate. The scans clearly show extensive disease progression. We're transitioning to palliative care. That's final." But I'd worked with Dr. Foster for 8 years. I knew how he communicated diagnoses, how he handled difficult cases. This wasn't like him. He was normally compassionate, detailed, willing to discuss cases with nursing staff. Now he was defensive and abrupt. I requested access to Christopher's electronic medical records to review the scan images myself. On December 21st, my access was denied. The system showed my credentials didn't have sufficient authorization to view that patient's imaging studies. This had never happened before in my 16 years at St. Vincent's. I went to my supervisor, head nurse Rachel Pemberton, and explained my concerns. She listened carefully, then made a call. 5 minutes later, she hung up and told me that Dr. Foster had personally restricted access to Christopher's files due to privacy concerns raised by the family. This was a lie. Patricia had never raised privacy concerns. She told me repeatedly she was grateful for my care and wanted me involved in every aspect of Christopher's treatment. I said this to Rachel. She gave me a hard look. "Angela, you're an excellent nurse, but you're overstepping. The doctor has made his decision. Accept it and focus on keeping the child comfortable." On December 23rd, Patricia asked me point blank, "Angela, do you believe Christopher is dying?" I hesitated. I had no proof, just instinct and inconsistencies. But I couldn't lie to her. "Patricia, I think you should request a second opinion from another oncologist. I think you should ask to see the actual scan images, not just what's shown on a computer screen. I think you should ask questions until you get answers that make sense." She grabbed my hand. "Thank you. I knew something felt wrong. I'll call another hospital tomorrow." She never got the chance. That evening, December 23rd, Dr. Foster admitted Christopher to our inpatient ward for what he called pain management optimization. Christopher had complained of a headache, which Dr. Foster said was consistent with the brain metastases. He ordered a morphine drip at a low dose to keep Christopher comfortable. Patricia wanted to stay overnight, but Dr. Foster convinced her to go home and rest. "You've been here for weeks straight. Go home, sleep in your own bed. Spend Christmas Eve with your mother. Christopher will be fine. We'll call if anything changes." Ellen Davis added her voice, insisting Patricia needed rest. Reluctantly, Patricia agreed. She kissed Christopher goodnight at 8:30 p.m. and left. I was working the night shift Christmas Eve. Our ward was quiet. Most of the kids who could go home for the holiday had been discharged. Only 3 patients remained, including Christopher. I checked on him at 9 p.m., 10:15 p.m., and 11:43 p.m. Each time he was sleeping peacefully, vital signs stable, morphine drip running at the prescribed 12 milligrams per hour. I did my rounds on the other end of the ward, checking on our other 2 patients. This took approximately 15 minutes. When I returned to Christopher's room at 12:01 a.m. on Christmas Day, the pump was set to 48 milligrams per hour. My heart stopped. That dosage would be fatal for a child Christopher's size within 2 hours, possibly less given his weakened condition. I immediately shut down the drip and checked his vital signs. His respirations were already depressed. 6 breaths per minute when normal for his age would be 20. His oxygen saturation was dropping. I called a code and started naloxone to reverse the opioid effects. The response team arrived within minutes. We managed to stabilize him, but it was close. Dr. Foster arrived at 12:23 a.m. responding to the code. His first question was, "Who changed the pump settings?" I explained I'd found the pump at the elevated dosage and shut it down immediately. He looked at the pump, looked at me, and said, "That's impossible. The setting change would have required physician authorization via the electronic system. No authorization was entered. You must have misread it." I absolutely had not misread it. I'd worked with those pumps for 16 years. I knew what I'd seen. I showed him the pump history log, which recorded the change at 11:54 p.m. He examined it, then said, "This shows an unauthorized adjustment. We'll need to investigate." "Nurse Torres, you were the only staff member in this room during that time frame. Can you explain how this happened?" He was setting me up. The implication was clear. Either I'd changed the pump myself, or I'd failed to notice someone else doing it. Both scenarios made me criminally negligent at best, a murderer at worst. I stated clearly for the record that I had not touched the pump settings and that someone else must have entered the room during the 15 minutes I was attending to other patients. Dr. Foster's expression was cold. "This is a serious matter. I'm filing an incident report. You're suspended pending investigation, effective immediately. Hospital security will escort you out." I was in shock, but I wasn't going quietly. As security escorted me from the ward, I stopped at the nurses' station and grabbed the sign-in log that tracked everyone entering the pediatric ward after visiting hours. It showed Dr. Foster had badge accessed the ward at 11:48 p.m., 6 minutes before the pump settings were changed. I photographed the log with my phone before security took me away. Dr. Foster had been on the ward. He had access to Christopher's room. He could have changed the pump. I was escorted to the parking lot at 1:15 a.m. on Christmas morning. I sat in my car, trying to process what had just happened. Then I did something that probably saved Christopher's life and certainly destroyed mine. I called Patricia Davis. She answered on the first ring, voice thick with sleep. "Angela, what's wrong?" I told her everything. The suspicious diagnosis, the denied records access, the morphine overdose, the security log showing Dr. Foster on the ward at the exact time the pump was changed. I told her to get to the hospital immediately and to not let them transfer Christopher to hospice. I told her to document everything and consider calling the police. Patricia arrived at the hospital at 2:30 a.m. with her mother and an attorney, a family friend named Donald Burke, who practiced estate law but was at least someone official. They demanded to see Christopher and his complete medical records. They demanded an explanation for the morphine overdose. Hospital administration was called in despite the holiday. By dawn on December 25th, St. Vincent's Children's Hospital was in crisis mode. Patricia officially requested Christopher's transfer to Johns Hopkins, which was granted. He was transported by 10 a.m. Christmas morning. At Johns Hopkins, Christopher was examined by Dr. Samantha Liu, a pediatric oncologist with 30 years' experience. She ordered new scans and reviewed the scans allegedly showing brain and spinal metastases from St. Vincent's. On December 28th, Dr. Liu met with Patricia and delivered stunning news. Christopher's cancer had not spread to his brain or spine. The scans from St. Vincent's were either misread or belonged to a different patient entirely. Christopher's leukemia was responding to treatment. He was not terminal. He did not need hospice. He needed continued chemotherapy, which they would provide. Patricia immediately filed complaints with the Maryland Board of Physicians and the Hospital Licensing Board. She also filed a police report alleging attempted murder. Baltimore police opened an investigation on December 29th. I was interviewed on December 30th by Detective James Crawford. I told him everything, provided my photographs of the security log, gave him copies of my nursing notes documenting the morphine pump change. He seemed genuinely concerned and said he'd follow up. On January the 4th, 2016, I received a certified letter from St. Vincent's Hospital. My employment was terminated effective immediately for gross negligence and violation of patient safety protocols. The letter stated that their investigation had determined I was responsible for the unauthorized morphine dosage change, and that I had attempted to blame Dr. Foster to cover my error. This was a lie. I had never touched that pump. But it was my word against a respected oncologist, and the hospital had already decided who to believe. I filed for unemployment. My claim was denied because I'd been terminated for cause. I contacted my union representative. He told me the union wouldn't fight the termination because the evidence against me was too strong. What evidence? The hospital's internal investigation, which I was never allowed to see. I hired an attorney, Michelle Huang, to file a wrongful termination lawsuit. She reviewed my case and agreed it looked suspicious, but warned me that fighting a hospital with deep pockets and powerful attorneys would be expensive and difficult. Meanwhile, the police investigation went nowhere. On January 15th, Detective Crawford called and said the case was being closed due to insufficient evidence. When I pressed him, he admitted the hospital had provided statements from 3 nurses who claimed they'd witnessed me exhibiting erratic behavior and making medication errors in the weeks before Christmas. These nurses were Diane Sullivan, Karen Rhodes, and Jessica Phelps, all 3 of whom worked different shifts than me, and whom I'd barely interacted with. They were lying, but their lies were documented in official statements. Crawford said, "Ms. Torres, I believe something wrong happened, but I can't prove what. The hospital says you made a mistake and they fired you. Without evidence of intentional harm, there's no criminal case." I asked about the security log showing Dr. Foster on the ward. Crawford said the hospital explained that Dr. Foster frequently checked on critical patients during night shifts, and his presence didn't prove anything. I asked about the misdiagnosis, the fake scans showing Christopher was terminal when he wasn't. Crawford said that was a medical malpractice issue, not criminal. The police were done. The case was closed. Patricia Davis's complaint to the Maryland Board of Physicians went further. An investigation was opened into Dr. Raymond Foster's treatment of Christopher Davis. This should have been my vindication. But on March 3, 2016, the board issued its findings. Dr. Foster had made an honest diagnostic error in interpreting Christopher's scans. Such errors, while unfortunate, did not constitute medical malpractice or warrant disciplinary action. The board noted that Dr. Foster had an otherwise spotless record and that Christopher was ultimately fine, so no lasting harm had occurred. Except lasting harm had occurred. I was fired from a career I loved. My reputation was destroyed. I couldn't get another nursing job anywhere in Maryland. Hospitals wouldn't even grant me interviews. I eventually found work as a home health aide, making a fraction of my former salary. My marriage fell apart under the financial stress. I filed for bankruptcy in 2017, all because I'd noticed a morphine pump running at a lethal dosage and saved a child's life. But the question remains, why? Why did Dr. Foster want Christopher Davis dead? I've spent 9 years trying to answer that, and I finally found something. In 2019, I obtained Christopher's insurance records through Patricia, who'd given me permission to review anything that might help explain what happened. The records showed something interesting. St. Vincent's Hospital had billed Christopher's insurance nearly $400,000 for treatments between November and December 2015. But according to the itemized bills, a significant portion of that, approximately $175,000, was for procedures and medications Christopher never received. Insurance fraud. Dr. Foster had been billing for expensive treatments he wasn't providing, pocketing the difference or funneling it somewhere within the hospital system. Christopher's unexpected improvement meant he'd need months more of real treatment, which meant real scrutiny of his medical records and billing. If Christopher went into hospice and died quickly, the billing irregularities would never be caught. No one audits a dead child's medical records, but if Christopher lived and transferred to another hospital, which he did, someone might notice the discrepancies. Someone might ask questions. I provided this information to the FBI in 2019, hoping they'd investigate healthcare fraud at St. Vincent's. I never heard back. I sent it to investigative journalists at the Baltimore Sun. They showed initial interest, then stopped responding. I contacted the Maryland Attorney General's office. No response. It's been 6 years since I found evidence of systematic fraud. Nothing has happened. No investigation, no accountability, nothing. Christopher Davis is alive. He's 16 now, cancer-free since 2017, a healthy teenager who wants to be a paleontologist. Patricia says he's thriving, that he barely remembers those terrible days in the hospital. That's the only good news in this entire nightmare. But Dr. Raymond Foster is still practicing medicine at St. Vincent's Children's Hospital. He's still treating vulnerable children. And based on billing records I've reviewed from public databases, the suspicious patterns continue. I believe he's still defrauding insurance companies, still providing substandard care, still putting children at risk. I'm 53 years old, working for $18 an hour, helping elderly people bathe and take their medications. I lost everything for doing the right thing, but I'd do it again. Christopher is alive because I checked that pump, because I called his mother, because I refused to be silent. I just wish being right mattered more than being powerful. I wish saving a life counted for something. I wish the system protected people who tell the truth instead of destroying them. If you work at St. Vincent's Children's Hospital in Baltimore, if you've noticed irregular billing or questionable treatment decisions, if you have information about Dr. Raymond Foster or administrative cover-ups, please reach out. Use anonymous channels. Protect yourself. But please help me stop this before another child is harmed. Christopher got lucky. The next one might not. The truck went through the ice at exactly 3:17 a.m. on December 26, 2009, according to the GPS tracker recovered from the wreckage. The ice was 14 inches thick at that location, more than enough to support a fully loaded semi traveling at safe speeds. The temperature had been a steady -22 degrees Fahrenheit for 11 consecutive days. There was no mechanical failure, no evidence of excessive speed, no explanation for why a 43-year-old experienced ice road trucker named Lucas Whitfield drove his rig into a deliberately weakened section of lake ice and drowned in his cab. No explanation except the one that makes me unemployable and branded a conspiracy theorist in the mining industry I've worked in for 26 years. I'm Terence Volkman, formerly Senior Safety Inspector for Northern Territories Mining Corporation, operating out of Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, Canada. I was responsible for monitoring safety compliance on winter ice roads used to transport equipment and ore from remote mining sites. Lucas Whitfield wasn't the first driver to die on my watch, but he was the first one murdered, and I can prove it, not that anyone wants to hear the proof. Lucas worked for Polar Transport Services, a contracted hauling company that ran supplies to NTMC's diamond mining operations above the Arctic Circle. He'd been driving ice roads for 19 years, knew every route, every condition, every risk. He'd survived whiteouts, equipment failures, and temperatures that would kill an unprepared person in minutes. He was careful, methodical, exactly the kind of driver you want on treacherous winter routes. He'd logged over 2 million kilometers on ice roads without a single at-fault accident. His safety record was impeccable. The route Lucas was driving that night was one he'd traveled dozens of times. The Eastern Transport Corridor across Great Slave Lake, connecting Yellowknife to the Mackay Lake mining site, 230 kilometers northeast. It's a critical supply line during winter months when the roads are frozen solid and can support heavy equipment. During peak season, December through March, we'd have 15 to 20 trucks making this run daily. Safety protocols were strict. Ice thickness was measured every morning at marked intervals. Any section measuring less than 12 inches was closed immediately. On December 25, 2009, Christmas Day, I conducted the routine morning safety survey of the Eastern Corridor with my field team, 2 junior inspectors, Craig Newsom and Heather Boyd. We drilled test cores every 500 meters along the marked route. Every measurement came back between 14 and 18 inches of solid, clear ice. Perfect conditions. I filed my daily report at 11 a.m. Route open, all safety thresholds exceeded, conditions optimal. Lucas Whitfield departed Yellowknife at 8:45 p.m. that evening, hauling drilling equipment valued at $2.3 million. At 3:17 a.m., his truck's GPS signal stopped transmitting. The company dispatcher, Marina Kowalski, tried radio contact. No response. At 4:30 a.m., when Lucas was 2 hours overdue at Mackay Lake, Polar Transport requested we conduct a search. I assembled a team and headed out at first light, approximately 8:45 a.m. on December the 26th. We found the breakthrough point at kilometer marker 47, roughly halfway along the route. The ice had given way in a circular pattern approximately 12 meters in diameter. Lucas's truck was at the bottom of the lake in 38 meters of water. Recovery operations took 3 days. When we finally pulled the wreckage up on December 29th, Lucas's body was still in the cab, frozen, seatbelt fastened. The cab showed no signs of fire, no evidence of mechanical malfunction. The load was properly secured. Everything pointed to the ice simply failing beneath him, except the ice shouldn't have failed. Not 14-inch clear ice in minus 22-degree weather. Not on a route I'd personally certified safe less than 18 hours earlier. I went back to the breakthrough site on December 30th with my drilling equipment. I took 12 core samples in a grid pattern around the failure point. What I found was impossible. The ice surrounding the breakthrough area was consistently 15 to 17 inches thick, exactly what my measurements had shown the day before. But when I analyzed the ice fragments from the breakthrough point itself, they told a different story. These weren't natural ice formation patterns. The crystalline structure was wrong. There were air pockets and inconsistencies suggesting the ice at that specific point had been deliberately weakened. Specifically, someone had drilled holes through the ice in a circular pattern, filled them with warm water to refreeze them with structural weakness built in, then covered the surface with snow to hide the alteration. It's an old technique, actually. Loggers used to use it to sink timber they wanted to hide. Done correctly, it's nearly impossible to detect until the ice gives way. Lucas would have had no warning. One moment, solid ice. The next moment, his 30-ton truck was crashing through into freezing water. Death would have come quickly. The cab would have flooded in seconds. Even if he'd managed to release his seatbelt, the door wouldn't open against water pressure. He drowned, trapped in his seat, knowing he was going to die, probably understanding it wasn't an accident. I documented everything. I took photographs of the ice samples showing the irregular patterns. I wrote a detailed 23-page report explaining my findings and submitted it to NTMC management on January 4, 2010. I recommended a full criminal investigation, suggested contacting the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, proposed shutting down the Eastern Corridor until a complete security review could be conducted. My supervisor, Operations Director Arnold Henriksen, called me into his office on January 5th. "Terry, I've reviewed your report. It's concerning, but I think you're seeing patterns that aren't there. Ice can fail for many reasons. Air temperature fluctuations, water currents under the ice, natural stress points. Lucas Whitfield's death was a tragedy, but sometimes experienced drivers get complacent, make mistakes. We'll note the incident in our safety reviews and continue monitoring conditions." I told him this wasn't about natural ice failure or driver error. I showed him the photographs. I explained the crystalline structure analysis. He looked at the evidence and said, "Terry, who would deliberately weaken ice on a mining transport route? What would be the motive? This is the middle of nowhere. It doesn't make sense." But it did make sense if you knew what Lucas Whitfield had been doing in the weeks before his death. I'd learned this from his widow, Alison Whitfield, whom I visited on January 6th to offer condolences. Alison was devastated, angry, and very willing to talk. She told me Lucas had been documenting safety violations at the Mackay Lake mining site for months. Inadequate ventilation in the underground shafts, expired equipment certifications, insufficient emergency protocols. He'd been keeping a detailed log with photographs and dates. He'd planned to report everything to territorial mining authorities after the Christmas holiday. He'd told Alison on December 24th that he was bringing the documentation with him on his December 25th run to hand off to a contact who worked at Mackay Lake. Lucas's truck had been carrying more than drilling equipment that night. It had been carrying evidence of systematic safety violations that could have resulted in millions in fines and possible criminal charges against NTMC management. Evidence that was now at the bottom of Great Slave Lake in a flooded truck cab. I asked Alison if Lucas had kept copies of his documentation. She said he'd kept everything on his personal laptop, which he'd had with him in the truck. Gone. All of it. I reported this new information to Arnold Henriksen on January 7th. I suggested that Lucas Whitfield had been deliberately killed to prevent him from exposing safety violations at Mackay Lake. Henriksen's face went red. "Detective Volkman, that's quite a leap from some unusual ice patterns. You're accusing this company of murder based on speculation and grieving widow testimony. I'm telling you officially, drop this. File your safety report, note the fatality, move on. If you continue making wild accusations, you'll find yourself looking for new employment." I didn't drop it. I contacted the RCMP detachment in Yellowknife on January 8th and requested they open a criminal investigation into Lucas Whitfield's death. I met with Corporal Benjamin McKay and presented all my evidence. The ice analysis, the testimony from Alison Whitfield about the safety violation documentation, the motive for murder. Mackay listened carefully and said he'd look into it. On January 12th, he called me back. "Mr. Volkman, I've reviewed the incident with my superiors. Without direct evidence of foul play, we can't justify a murder investigation. The coroner has ruled the death accidental due to ice road hazards. I'm sorry, but there's nothing more we can do." The coroner, Dr. Philip Rousseau, had performed the autopsy on January 3rd and issued his report January 4th, before I'd even submitted my detailed findings about the ice. I obtained a copy of his report. It was perfunctory. Death by drowning, consistent with vehicular accident through ice. No signs of trauma suggesting foul play. He hadn't considered that the ice failure itself was the foul play. When I contacted him on January 13th to discuss my findings, he was dismissive. "Mr. Volkman, I understand you're upset about this tragedy, but I'm a medical doctor, not an ice specialist. The deceased drowned in an ice road accident. That's what my report states. If you have concerns about the ice conditions, take them to your company." I was stuck. The RCMP wouldn't investigate without coroner support. The coroner wouldn't revise his ruling without RCMP pressure. My company wanted the whole thing buried. So I went outside the system. I contacted every journalist who'd ever covered mining industry safety issues. One reporter, Malcolm Fraser with CBC North, agreed to meet with me on January 18th. I showed him everything. He was genuinely interested. Said it could be a major story about mining industry corruption and worker safety. He visited Alison Whitfield, interviewed her on camera, started digging into NTMC's safety record. On February 3rd, 2010, I was called into Arnold Henrikson's office again. This time, the company's legal counsel, Judith Munro, was present. "Mr. Volkman, we've become aware that you've been discussing confidential company matters with media representatives. This is a direct violation of your employment contract and company policy. Effective immediately, you're suspended without pay pending termination proceedings." I was escorted from the premises that day. 26 years of dedicated service ended in an hour. Malcolm Fraser's story never aired. He called me on February 10th and said his producers had killed the piece. "Terry," I tried. But NTMC is a major advertiser with CBC. Legal got involved. They threatened litigation over defamatory allegations. "My editor says we need more concrete evidence before we can run something this serious." I'm sorry. More concrete evidence. Like what? A confession? Video footage of someone drilling holes in the ice? My termination was finalized on February 28, 2010. I was fired for violating confidentiality agreements and insubordination. I filed for wrongful dismissal. My case was settled out of court in June 2010 for $40,000 and a non-disparagement agreement that forbids me from publicly discussing Northern Territory's mining corporation or making allegations about company practices. I signed it because I needed the money. I've regretted it every day since. But here's what I can say without violating that agreement. Lucas Whitfield is dead. His widow received a $250,000 life insurance payout and closure of his pension account. No admission of wrongdoing, no investigation, no justice. The safety violations he documented were never publicly addressed. McKay Lake Mine continued operating without interruption. I've never worked in the mining industry again. I'm 59 now, working as a building superintendent in Winnipeg, Manitoba. My expertise, my experience, all worthless because I asked questions about one dead truck driver. I check on Alison Whitfield occasionally. She remarried in 2014, moved to British Columbia, built a new life. She doesn't talk about Lucas anymore. It's too painful. And what's the point? No one listened. I also monitor mining industry safety reports. Between 2010 and 2024, there have been 7 additional ice road fatalities in the Northwest Territories, involving drivers working for companies contracted to NTMC. 7. All ruled accidental. I can't prove any connection to Lucas's death, but the pattern haunts me. If you worked at McKay Lake Mine in 2009-2010, if you know anything about safety violations or the circumstances of Lucas Whitfield's death, if you witnessed anything unusual on the ice roads that winter, please find a way to share that information safely. Lucas kept those safety logs because he believed workers deserved protection. He died trying to do the right thing. His death should mean something. The shipping label on the body bag was wrong. I noticed it at 7:23 a.m. on December 27, 2013, when the morgue transport arrived at Riverside County Medical Examiner's office in Riverside, California. The deceased was listed as 84-year-old Margaret Schultz, natural causes, transferred from Mercy General Hospital for routine autopsy per county protocol. Standard procedure, except when I unzipped the bag, the body inside was a Hispanic male, approximately 35 years old, with ligature marks on his neck and defensive wounds on his hands. Someone at Mercy General had sent us the wrong body, or maybe they'd sent us exactly the body they wanted hidden. I'm Dr. Richard Castellano, Deputy Medical Examiner for Riverside County, 28 years experience with approximately 12,000 autopsies performed. I've seen every kind of death: natural, accidental, suicide, homicide. I've testified in hundreds of trials. My professional credibility is unimpeachable, or at least it was until I started asking why Mercy General Hospital kept sending us bodies that didn't match their paperwork. The young Hispanic man had been dead approximately 14 to 18 hours based on rigor mortis and liver temperature. Cause of death appeared to be strangulation by ligature, possibly a cord or rope based on the pattern of the marks. The defensive wounds on his hands suggested he'd fought his attacker. This was clearly a homicide, not an 84-year-old woman dying of natural causes. I immediately called Mercy General's morgue coordinator to report the error. A woman named Brenda Simmons answered. I explained the situation. There was a long pause before she responded. Dr. Castellano, that's impossible. We sent Margaret Schultz. I verified the body tag myself before transport. There must be some mistake on your end. I assured her the mistake was not on our end. I was looking at a Hispanic male homicide victim, not an elderly Caucasian woman. Could she please check their morgue and confirm they still had Margaret Schultz? She said she'd call me back. 30 minutes later, she did. Dr. Castellano, I've confirmed that we do have a body tagged as Margaret Schultz here. It matches the description. I can't explain what you're seeing. Perhaps the transport company picked up the wrong body. That didn't make sense. The body I'd came with Mercy General's transport paperwork, their body tag, their chain of custody documentation. Someone at Mercy General had deliberately switched the bodies. I contacted the transport company, Valley Medical Transport. Their driver, Eddie Ochoa, was adamant he'd picked up one body from Mercy General's morgue at 6:45 a.m. and delivered it directly to our facility. He had a signed release from Brenda Simmons. The paperwork matched. Someone at the hospital had given Eddie a homicide victim labeled as a natural death. I called Mercy General Hospital's administrative offices and requested to speak to someone in authority. I was connected to the hospital administrator, a man named Gregory Dalton. I explained the situation calmly and professionally. We had received a body that was clearly a homicide victim mislabeled as a natural death. This was a serious chain of custody failure requiring immediate investigation. Dalton sounded genuinely shocked. Dr. Castellano, this is deeply concerning. I'll launch an immediate internal review. Can you send me photographs and documentation? I did, within the hour. Meanwhile, I had a homicide victim with no identification, no personal effects, no medical records. I took fingerprints and dental x-rays for identification purposes and contacted the Riverside Police Department to report a suspected homicide. Detective Paula Henderson responded at 10:15 a.m. She examined the body, reviewed my preliminary findings, and agreed this was clearly a criminal matter. Any idea who this guy is? She asked. I had none. No wallet, no phone, no identifying information had been sent with the body. Detective Henderson started running the fingerprints through databases. On December 28th, we got an identification hit. The victim was Jorge Martinez, 34 years old, resident of Riverside, California. He worked as a maintenance technician at Mercy General Hospital. He'd been employed there for 6 years. He'd been reported missing by his wife, Claudia Martinez, on December 26th, when he failed to return home from his overnight shift on Christmas Eve. She'd called the hospital, been told he'd left work at 7 a.m. December 25th, and assumed maybe he'd gone somewhere to decompress after working the holiday. By December 26th, when he still hadn't come home, she filed a missing persons report. Jorge Martinez worked at the hospital where his body was found, and then deliberately mislabeled for transport to our facility. This was not a coincidence. Detective Henderson and I visited Mercy General on December 29th. We met with Gregory Dalton, who seemed nervous and defensive. He claimed their internal review had found no evidence of deliberate mislabeling. It appeared to be an unfortunate clerical error during a busy holiday period. Multiple patients had died Christmas Day, and in the confusion, body tags had been mixed up. These things happen, Doctor. We're implementing new protocols to prevent future errors. I asked where Margaret Schultz was now. Dalton said she'd been transported to a private funeral home per her family's wishes after the error was discovered. I asked for the name of the funeral home and the family's contact information. He said that was protected by privacy laws and he couldn't share it without proper authorization. Detective Henderson intervened. Mr. Dalton, this is now a homicide investigation. We need to verify that Margaret Schultz is actually deceased and where her body is located. Provide the information, or I'll get a warrant. Reluctantly, Dalton provided contact information for Schultz Funeral Home and the supposed family member who'd made arrangements, a man named Robert Schultz. Detective Henderson called the funeral home. They had no record of receiving Margaret Schultz or any body from Mercy General Hospital on December 27th or 28th. She called Robert Schultz. The number was disconnected. We'd been lied to. There was no Margaret Schultz. The paperwork was fabricated. Jorge Martinez's body had been deliberately sent to our morgue, mislabeled in hopes it would be cremated as a natural death before anyone noticed. On December 30th, Detective Henderson obtained a warrant to search Mercy General Hospital's security footage and personnel records. What we found was damning. Security footage from December 25th, 3:30 a.m. showed Jorge Martinez entering a restricted area in the hospital's basement, specifically the pharmaceutical storage room. He was carrying a small notebook. 45 minutes later, footage showed 2 men in hospital security uniforms dragging an unconscious Jorge Martinez down a service corridor toward the morgue. The men were identified as hospital security guards, Trevor Walsh and Nathan Bergman. Walsh and Bergman were brought in for questioning on December 31st. Initially, they denied everything. When confronted with the security footage, they lawyered up immediately. Through their attorney, they claimed Jorge Martinez had been caught stealing prescription medications, and they'd restrained him using approved security protocols. He'd been alive when they left him in a holding room. They had no idea how he ended up dead. This story fell apart quickly. The autopsy clearly showed Jorge had been strangled, not subdued with approved holds. The timeline didn't work. And most importantly, the pharmaceutical storage room inventory logs showed no missing medications. Detective Henderson pressed the investigation. Jorge's widow, Claudia, provided crucial information. Jorge had told her on December 23rd that he discovered something disturbing at work. He wouldn't give details, said he needed to confirm what he was seeing before reporting it. He had planned to gather evidence during his Christmas Eve overnight shift when fewer people were around. Claudia said Jorge had mentioned something about medication discrepancies and someone stealing in massive quantities. He'd kept notes in a small blue notebook that he carried with him. That notebook was missing from Jorge's body and personal effects. On January 3, 2014, Detective Henderson and a team of investigators executed a broader warrant at Mercy General, specifically targeting the pharmacy department. What they discovered was systematic theft of controlled substances, opioids primarily, valued at approximately $850,000 over an 18-month period. The theft was sophisticated, involving falsified patient records and altered inventory logs. It wasn't random employee theft. It was organized, high-level, requiring access to administrative systems. Further investigation revealed the head of pharmacy operations, Dr. Kenneth Ashford, had been diverting medications for resale. He had connections to a drug distribution network operating in Southern California. Jorge Martinez, doing routine maintenance in the pharmaceutical storage area, had noticed inventory discrepancies that didn't match the official logs. Being thorough and honest, he'd started documenting what he saw. On Christmas Eve, he'd entered the storage area during his shift to photograph evidence. He'd been caught by security guards Walsh and Bergman, who were complicit in the theft operation. Rather than let Jorge report what he'd found, they killed him. Dr. Ashford, Trevor Walsh, and Nathan Bergman were arrested on January 8, 2014, charged with first-degree murder, drug theft, and conspiracy. The case seemed solid. Jorge Martinez would get justice. His family would have closure. The system worked, except it didn't. On February 12, 2014, all charges against Dr. Kenneth Ashford were dropped. The district attorney's office released a statement saying that after reviewing the evidence, they determined there was insufficient proof connecting Dr. Ashford to Jorge Martinez's murder or the drug theft operation. The statement suggested Walsh and Bergman had acted independently, that Ashford had been unaware of their criminal activities. This was absurd. The financial records clearly showed Ashford had been profiting from the drug sales. The inventory logs had required his administrative access to falsify. I contacted the assistant district attorney handling the case, a man named Leonard Pryor. I asked why the charges had been dropped. He was evasive. Dr. Castellano, prosecutorial decisions involve complex legal considerations you may not fully understand. We determined we couldn't prove our case beyond reasonable doubt. It happens. I pressed him. What about the financial evidence? What about the administrative access logs? He grew irritated. Are you questioning my professional judgment? I suggest you focus on medical examining and leave prosecution to prosecutors. Meanwhile, Trevor Walsh and Nathan Bergman pleaded guilty to manslaughter and drug theft in exchange for reduced sentences. Walsh got 12 years, Bergman got 10 years. Both testified that they'd killed Jorge Martinez, acting on orders from someone they identified only as the doctor. But both claimed they never knew his actual name and couldn't positively identify Dr. Ashford. Convenient. The prosecution didn't push back. On March 30, 2014, both men were sentenced and transferred to state prison. Dr. Kenneth Ashford resigned from Mercy General Hospital in April 2014 with a generous severance package. No admission of wrongdoing, no criminal record, free to practice medicine elsewhere. I checked. He's currently working as chief pharmacist at a large hospital system in Phoenix, Arizona. A man who orchestrated the murder of a hospital employee to cover up drug theft is dispensing medications to patients. But my problems were just beginning. In May 2014, I was contacted by the Riverside County Board of Supervisors. They informed me that my handling of the Jorge Martinez case had created unnecessary controversy and damaged relationships with important community partners, meaning Mercy General Hospital, which employed hundreds of county residents and donated generously to political campaigns. I was being reassigned from homicide cases to administrative duties effective immediately. I objected strenuously. I'd done my job correctly. I'd identified a homicide, reported it properly, cooperated fully with law enforcement. I'd done everything by the book. The board's representative, Supervisor Donald Krause, was blunt. Dr. Castellano, You embarrassed a major county employer with accusations that turned out to be overblown. Dr. Ashford was cleared of all charges. Perhaps your judgment isn't as sound as we thought. Take the reassignment or retire. Those are your options. I refused to retire. I took the administrative assignment, which meant reviewing paperwork and supervising junior staff rather than performing autopsies. My expertise was wasted. My career was effectively over. In 2016, I took early retirement at age 62. I now work as a consultant for private attorneys on medical examiner issues, making a fraction of my former salary. Jorge Martinez's widow, Claudia, sued Mercy General Hospital in civil court for wrongful death. The case was settled out of court in 2015 for an undisclosed amount, with a strict non-disclosure agreement preventing Claudia from discussing the case publicly. She got money. She didn't get justice or truth or accountability. Trevor Walsh was released from prison in 2022 after serving 8 years. Nathan Bergman is due for release in 2026. Neither has ever provided additional information about who ordered Jorge's murder. I'm 72 years old. I've spent nearly 3 decades examining the dead and speaking for those who can't speak for themselves. I've always believed the truth matters, that evidence tells stories, that justice is possible. The Jorge Martinez case destroyed that belief. A good man, a father of 3, was murdered for discovering theft. His killers got light sentences. The mastermind walked free. And I was punished for doing my job correctly. If you worked at Mercy General Hospital in Riverside between 2012 and 2014, if you know anything about pharmaceutical theft or the circumstances of Jorge Martinez's death, if you witnessed anything suspicious, please find a way to share that information. Jorge's children deserve to know their father died trying to do the right thing, and that his death meant something. Right now, it doesn't. Right now, his murder was just another successful cover-up. The conversation in cell block D lasted exactly 11 minutes and 43 seconds on December 22, 2016. I know because I was monitoring the audio feed from my station, Standard Overnight Protocol at Crestview State Penitentiary in eastern Pennsylvania. 2 inmates, cells adjacent to each other, talking through the ventilation system about a murder they'd both witnessed on the outside. A murder that had never been reported, never investigated, never solved because the victim was officially still alive. Officially alive and collecting government disability checks, according to what I heard. That conversation should have triggered an investigation. Instead, it triggered my termination and 3 years of hell that nearly destroyed my life. My name is Derek Hamilton, former correctional officer, SECU at Crestview State Penitentiary. I worked there for 14 years, maintained an exemplary service record, never had a disciplinary action. I'd planned to work another 6 years and retire with full pension at age 55. That plan died the moment I reported what I'd heard in cell block D. The 2 inmates were Hector Silva and Damon White, both serving time for drug-related offenses. Silva was 41, White was 38. Neither had particularly violent records. They were model prisoners by Crestview standards. No fights, no disciplinary issues, just doing their time quietly. On December 22nd, around 2:15 a.m. during my overnight shift, I heard them talking through the air vent that connected their cells. Inmates aren't supposed to communicate after lights out, but minor rule violations like quiet conversation aren't worth the paperwork unless something serious is being discussed. What I heard was serious. Silva was talking about someone named Anthony Caruso, describing how Caruso had been killed in August 2014 by a man named Nicholas Torrance during a dispute over drug territory in North Philadelphia. Silva described the murder in detail. Torrance had beaten Caruso with a tire iron behind an abandoned warehouse on Kensington Avenue, left him bleeding in an alley, came back an hour later to move the body. White confirmed the story, said he'd been there, had helped move Caruso's body into Torrance's van. They discussed how Torrance had disposed of the body in a construction site foundation that was poured the next day. Caruso was literally buried in concrete in the basement of a building in Philadelphia. But here's what made the conversation extraordinary. Silva mentioned that Caruso's family had continued collecting his disability checks for over 2 years after his death. Caruso had been receiving Social Security disability for a back injury. His mother, Rita Caruso, had access to his bank account and had kept the arrangement going, withdrawing money every month, pretending her son was still alive. Silva thought this was hilarious. White agreed it was brilliant fraud. I documented the conversation in my incident report, filed at the end of my shift, 6 a.m. December 22nd. I noted the specific details, recommended the information be forwarded to local law enforcement for investigation of a possible homicide and ongoing fraud. My supervisor, Sergeant Lawrence Keating, received the report at the start of his shift, 7 a.m. He called me before I left the facility. "Hamilton, you sure about this? Inmates bullshit constantly. You want to generate a whole investigation based on jailhouse gossip." I explained I'd heard specific details, names, dates, location, method of killing, disposal site. This wasn't vague bragging. This was 2 men discussing a crime they'd both participated in. Keating sighed. "Fine, I'll forward it up the chain. Don't hold your breath waiting for anyone to care." I went home and slept, assuming I'd done my duty and the system would handle it from there. On December 27th, I was called into Warden Patricia Brennan's office. With her was the facility's legal counsel, a man named Stuart Feldman, and an investigator from the State Inspector General's office named Carol Jennings. This seemed excessive for a routine inmate conversation report. Warden Brennan got straight to the point. "Officer Hamilton, we've reviewed your report from December 22nd regarding alleged statements by inmates Silva and White. We have concerns about the accuracy of your report and the circumstances under which you obtained this information." I was confused. Concerns about accuracy? I'd transcribed the conversation verbatim from the audio feed. Warden Brennan continued, "Officer Hamilton, there is no audio feed from cell block D ventilation systems. Our surveillance system doesn't capture audio from air vents, so either you're mistaken about what you heard or you violated protocols by engaging in unauthorized monitoring of inmate communications." This was absurd. Every cell block has audio monitoring as part of our security system. I'd been trained on it. I'd used it for 14 years. I told Warden Brennan this. She exchanged a look with Feldman, then said, "Officer Hamilton, I'm looking at our facility schematics right now. Audio monitoring is limited to common areas, visitation rooms, and phone calls. Individual cells and ventilation systems are not monitored for audio. If you heard this conversation, you must have been physically present near the cells, which would constitute intentional eavesdropping on private inmate conversations in violation of Department of Corrections policy. I was being set up. Someone had altered records or was lying about our monitoring capabilities to create a policy violation. I insisted the audio feeds existed and demanded they review the recordings from December 22nd. Inspector General Jennings responded, "We've reviewed all available recordings from that date. There are no recordings of the conversation you described. This raises questions about the veracity of your report." The meeting concluded with me being placed on administrative leave pending investigation. I was suspended with pay but forbidden from entering the facility or contacting other staff members. I left completely bewildered. I knew what I'd heard. I knew our systems recorded it. Someone was covering something up. I hired an attorney, a woman named Rebecca Stein, who specialized in employment law. She requested copies of all documentation related to my suspension and the investigation. What we received was troubling. According to the official facility records, Cell Block D had never been equipped with audio monitoring beyond the common areas. The system schematics showed no audio feeds from individual cells or ventilation ducts. Either I'd been mistaken for 14 years about our monitoring capabilities, or someone had falsified records. Rebecca advised me to request a polygraph examination to prove I was telling the truth about what I'd heard. The Department of Corrections declined my request, stating polygraphs were not standard procedure for administrative investigations. Meanwhile, Rebecca started investigating the claims I'd reported. She contacted Philadelphia Police Department and asked if they had any reports of Anthony Caruso being missing or deceased. They did not. She found Anthony Caruso's Social Security records. He was listed as alive, residing at an address in North Philadelphia with his mother, Rita Caruso. Rebecca visited the address on January 15, 2017. Rita Caruso answered the door. When Rebecca asked to speak with Anthony, Rita said he wasn't home, was out running errands. Rebecca explained she had information suggesting Anthony might be in danger and needed to verify his well-being. Rita became defensive and closed the door. Rebecca contacted Adult Protective Services and requested a welfare check. On January 18th, APS visited the Caruso home. Rita produced identification showing she was Anthony Caruso's mother and a power of attorney giving her access to his finances. She said Anthony was staying with relatives in New Jersey temporarily, but was fine. APS closed the case as unfounded. The construction site Silva had mentioned was real, a mixed-use development on Kensington Avenue completed in 2014. Rebecca hired a private investigator to research the project. The building's foundation had been poured on August 27, 2014, consistent with the timeline Silva had described. But without evidence of a crime, there was no way to get authorization to excavate a building foundation looking for a body that authorities didn't believe existed. My administrative investigation concluded on February 10, 2017. The findings. I had filed a false report based on fabricated information, potentially to harass inmates Silva and White or for unknown motivations. I was terminated for cause effective immediately, forfeiting my pension after 14 years of service. The Department of Corrections issued a statement saying I'd violated policy, damaged institutional integrity, and my termination was appropriate. I appealed through the union. My appeal was denied. I filed a wrongful termination lawsuit. The case dragged on for 2 years and was ultimately dismissed in 2019. The judge ruled that the Department of Corrections had properly documented their monitoring systems, and my claims were unsupported by physical evidence. My attorney fees exceeded $60,000. I lost my house. My wife divorced me in 2018, unable to handle the financial stress and my obsession with proving I'd been telling the truth. But I didn't stop. In 2019, I managed to contact Hector Silva, who'd been released from Crestview after completing his sentence. I asked him directly about the conversation I'd heard in December 2016. He denied everything. "Man, I don't know what you're talking about. I never said nothing about no murder. You must have me confused with someone else." He wouldn't speak to me further. Damon White was still incarcerated. I sent him multiple letters asking him to confirm the conversation. He never responded. I filed Freedom of Information requests for cell block demonitoring system documentation. The responses confirmed what the Department of Corrections had stated. No audio monitoring of individual cells existed. I requested documentation of when the monitoring systems had been installed and any modifications made. Most of those records were unavailable due to archival storage limitations. I'm 63 now, working part-time security at a shopping mall, living in a studio apartment, surviving on Social Security. I lost my career, my pension, my marriage, my home, all for reporting a conversation about murder and fraud. Anthony Caruso is still officially alive. His Social Security disability checks are still being deposited monthly. I've checked. The Philadelphia police have no missing person report, no investigation, no concern. I think about that conversation every day. 11 minutes and 43 seconds that destroyed my life. I heard what I heard. Two men discussing a murder they'd committed, a body they'd hidden, fraud they were aware of. I reported it properly, and I was destroyed for it. If you worked at Crestview State Penitentiary in 2016, if you know anything about audio monitoring systems in Cell Block D, if you have information about Anthony Caruso or Nicholas Torrance or any of the people mentioned in this account, please come forward. Use anonymous channels. Protect yourself, but help me prove I was telling the truth. Because right now, a murderer is free, a fraud continues, and a man who tried to do the right thing is living in poverty with a destroyed reputation. That shouldn't be how the system works. The rotors were still spinning when I reached the wreckage at 4:52 p.m. on December 23, 2018. The helicopter had impacted the ground, nose first at a 70-degree angle, approximately 18 minutes earlier, according to the last radar contact. Weather conditions were optimal. Clear skies. Visibility 10 miles. Winds at 8 knots, temperature 43 degrees Fahrenheit. The pilot, Christina Morales, had over 8,000 hours of flight time and an impeccable safety record. The aircraft, a Bell 407 medical helicopter, had passed its most recent maintenance inspection 6 days prior with no discrepancies noted. There was no mechanical failure, no weather event, no pilot error. The helicopter had been deliberately sabotaged, and I have documentation proving it. Documentation that cost me my career and nearly cost me my life. I'm Maxwell Garrison, former senior investigator with the National Transportation Safety Board, specialized in aviation accident reconstruction. 21 years with the NTSB, lead investigator on over 300 aircraft incidents. My work has led to safety improvements that have saved countless lives. I was supposed to retire in 2020 with honors and recognition for distinguished service. Instead, I was forced out in disgrace in 2019 for refusing to falsify my findings about Mercy Flight 447. Christina Morales was transporting a critically injured patient from a rural hospital in eastern Washington state to a major trauma center in Spokane. The patient was a 16-year-old girl named Emma Tillison who'd been injured in a car accident. Time-critical transfer, routine flight for Christina and her crew. Flight nurse Olivia Park and flight paramedic Jason Coleman. They departed Davenport Medical Center at 4:27 p.m., expected arrival in Spokane at 5:14 p.m. At 4:34 p.m., Christina radioed that she was experiencing control issues. At 4:36 p.m., the helicopter disappeared from radar. At 4:38 p.m., it augured into an empty field 3 miles south of Reardan, Washington. All 4 people aboard were killed instantly. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft was destroyed, fragmented across a debris field spanning 200 meters. I arrived on scene as part of the NTSB GO team at 4:52 p.m., less than 15 minutes after impact. The wreckage was still settling, fuel burning, the smell of burning metal and flesh overwhelming. This was my job. I'd worked dozens of fatal crashes. You develop emotional distance, focus on the technical investigation, find answers for the families. But something about this crash felt wrong from the moment I saw the debris pattern. We secured the scene and began preliminary documentation. My initial assessment focused on the impact angle and distribution of wreckage. The helicopter had come down in a controlled descent initially, then had pitched forward violently in the final seconds. The collective control stick was found in the wreckage in a position consistent with full down input, meaning Christina had been trying to reduce power and descend controllably. But the cyclic control, which manages the aircraft's pitch and roll, was in a forward position consistent with diving the aircraft nose down. These control inputs were contradictory. A pilot wouldn't simultaneously try to descend controllably and dive the aircraft into the ground. We recovered the aircraft's flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder on December 24th. The voice recorder captured Christina's final transmissions. At 4:34 p.m., Spokane approach, Mercy Flight 447. experiencing flight control anomaly, requesting priority handling. At 4:35 p.m. Controls are not responding correctly. I have input lag and contradictory response. At 4:36 p.m. I've lost cyclic authority, attempting auto-rotation. Then impact. She'd done everything correctly. She'd identified the problem, communicated it, attempted emergency procedures, but the aircraft hadn't responded. The flight data recorder showed something extraordinary. In the final 2 minutes of flight, the helicopter's cyclic control showed inputs that didn't match Christina's physical movements as described in her radio calls. Specifically, the data showed full forward cyclic input at 4:37 p.m., forcing the aircraft into a nose-down attitude. But Christina's voice on the radio at that same moment indicated she was attempting to level the aircraft. Someone or something else was controlling the helicopter. I examined the cyclic control mechanism during wreckage reconstruction on December 28th. Modern helicopters like the Bell 407 have fly-by-wire systems. Pilot inputs are transmitted electronically to servos that move the control surfaces. It's computer-mediated control, not direct mechanical linkage. This provides stability and safety features, but creates vulnerability to electronic interference or hacking. When I examined the control system's electronic components, I found something that didn't belong. A small device, roughly the size of a USB drive, spliced into the wiring harness between the cyclic control input and the servo controller. The device was sophisticated. It had wireless capability and appeared designed to intercept control inputs and substitute alternate commands. In simple terms, someone could override the pilot's controls remotely. I'd never seen anything like it in a civilian aircraft. I photographed it extensively, documented its position in the wiring system, and removed it for detailed laboratory analysis. This wasn't a mechanical failure or pilot error. This was deliberate sabotage. I reported my findings to my supervisor, Regional Director Harold Martinez, on December 29th. I recommended we immediately expand the investigation to include FBI involvement for criminal sabotage. Martinez looked at the photographs and the device and said we should proceed cautiously. Max, this is extraordinary. Before we bring in law enforcement and create a major incident, let's make sure we understand what we're looking at. Get the lab analysis done, document everything, then we'll decide next steps. The NTSB lab analysis was completed on January 7, 2019. The device was confirmed to be a sophisticated control override mechanism capable of receiving and executing remote commands via encrypted wireless signals. The lab's senior engineer, Susan Choi, told me she'd never seen civilian technology this advanced. Max, this is military-grade stuff. Someone with serious resources and technical capability built this. This wasn't some amateur. I asked if she could trace its origin. She said the components were commercially available, but the programming and integration were custom. No serial numbers, no identifying marks. Whoever made it knew how to avoid leaving traces. I submitted an updated report on January 9th, recommending FBI involvement and a criminal investigation. On January 11th, I was called to a meeting at NTSB headquarters in Washington, D.C., with Harold Martinez and the agency's chief counsel, Bernard Watkins. They informed me that after reviewing my findings, they'd decided to pursue an alternative explanation. Max, we agree something unusual happened here, but attributing it to deliberate sabotage requires evidence of motive and opportunity. Without that, we risk creating panic about aviation safety. We're going to classify this as an electrical system malfunction that interfered with flight controls. Rare, but not criminal. I objected strenuously. We had physical evidence of a sabotage device. We had proof someone had deliberately modified the aircraft's control system. Calling it a malfunction was a lie. Watkins cut me off. Investigator Garrison, your technical work is excellent, but you don't make policy decisions for this agency. We determine how findings are presented to the public. Your report will be revised to reflect a probable electrical malfunction. That's final." I refused. I stated clearly that I would not sign a report I knew to be false. Martinez tried to reason with me. "Max, you're 3 years from retirement. You've had a distinguished career. Don't ruin it by being difficult over terminology. The families get closure either way. The aircraft manufacturer will address the electrical issue. Everyone moves on." I said the families deserve the truth, that their loved ones were murdered, not killed by a malfunction, that someone had deliberately crashed that helicopter. The meeting ended poorly. I was ordered to revise my report and remove all references to sabotage. I refused. On January 18, 2019, I was placed on administrative leave pending review. On January 25th, I was offered early retirement with full benefits if I agreed to sign a non-disclosure agreement prohibiting me from discussing the Mercy Flight 447 investigation. I declined. On February 8th, I was terminated for insubordination and refusing to follow agency directives. But before I was fired, I'd made copies of everything: photographs of the device, lab reports, flight data recorder analysis, my complete investigation file. I sent copies to 3 investigative journalists who covered aviation safety. 2 never responded. The third, a reporter named Gregory Walsh with ProPublica, met with me in March 2019. He reviewed everything and agreed it looked like deliberate sabotage. He started investigating. Gregory discovered something crucial. Emma Tillerson, the 16-year-old patient being transported, was the daughter of State Senator William Tillerson, a Washington state legislator who'd been leading investigations into corruption in state government contracting. Senator Tillerson had scheduled testimony before a grand jury for January 2019 regarding kickback schemes involving millions in state infrastructure projects. Emma's death on December 23rd devastated him. He withdrew from public life, resigned his seat in March 2019, never testified. The grand jury investigation collapsed without his testimony. Was Emma's death deliberate murder to silence her father? Gregory pursued this theory. He interviewed Senator Tillerson, who confirmed he'd been investigating corruption and had received threats in the weeks before Emma's accident. He'd reported the threats to state police, but no action had been taken. Gregory requested those threat reports through public records. The state police claimed no such reports existed. Senator Tillerson was certain he'd filed them. Someone had destroyed the documentation. Gregory's investigation was gaining traction. He'd drafted a major story about the sabotaged helicopter and possible political assassination. Then in July 2019, ProPublica killed the story. Gregory called me furious and frustrated. "Max, my editors say we don't have enough to prove conspiracy. The NTSB's official finding is electrical malfunction. Without them supporting sabotage, we're accusing the government of a cover-up with no backing. Legal won't clear it." I was destroyed. The truth was documented, provable, and no one would publish it. Meanwhile, the official NTSB report on Mercy Flight 447 was released in June 2019, concluding that a probable electrical malfunction in the flight control system caused the crash. Recommendations were made for improved shielding of electronic components. No mention of sabotage. No mention of the device I'd found. My name appeared nowhere in the report. My work had been erased and replaced with lies. I couldn't let it go. I created a website in 2020 detailing the entire investigation, posting photographs and documentation. The website was taken down within a week for violating terms of service. Allegedly, I'd posted copyrighted government materials. I tried again with a different host. Same result. I sent packets of information to aviation safety organizations, pilot unions, congressional oversight committees. Most never responded. Those that did thanked me for my concern and said the NTSB's findings were authoritative. In November 2020, someone broke into my home while I was out. Nothing valuable was taken, but my home office was ransacked and my computer was destroyed. The backup drives where I'd stored my investigation files were gone. I still had copies in a safety deposit box, but the message was clear. Stop talking about this. In January 2021, I was involved in a single-vehicle accident on a rural road in Oregon where I'd retired. My brakes failed going down a steep grade. I managed to survive by steering into a ditch. The vehicle was totaled. Police investigated and said the brake lines had corroded and failed. The vehicle was only 4 years old and had been maintained regularly. I believe my brake lines were cut. I've stopped actively investigating. I'm 71 years old, living on Social Security and a partial pension. I have no resources left to fight. Christina Morales, Olivia Park, Jason Coleman, and Emma Tillerson are dead. The person or organization that sabotaged their helicopter was never identified or prosecuted. Senator William Tillerson never testified, and the corruption investigation he'd been pursuing died with his daughter. The NTSB lied in their official report, and I was destroyed for trying to tell the truth. If you have information about state government corruption in Washington state in 2018-2019, if you know anything about the crash of Mercy Flight 447, if you worked on that aircraft's maintenance or have information about unauthorized modifications, please find a way to share it safely. 4 people were murdered to silence a politician. Their deaths were covered up by the government agency, tasked with finding truth. That should terrify everyone who flies, everyone who trusts in aviation safety, everyone who believes in accountability. The file cabinet was in the basement storage room, unlabeled and locked, which is what caught my attention during the office move on December 20th, 2012. I was helping pack up our agency's records for transfer to a new building, routine relocation that happens periodically with government offices. Most of the storage cabinets were clearly marked with dates and case numbers, easy to categorize for moving. This one cabinet stood alone in a corner, covered in dust, with a heavy-duty padlock that looked newer than the cabinet itself. When I asked my supervisor, Amanda Fisher, what was in it, she looked uncomfortable and said she didn't know, probably old records scheduled for destruction. Something about her reaction made me curious. I'm Brianna McNally, formerly a social worker with Oregon Child Protective Services, Portland District Office. I spent 19 years working to protect vulnerable children, investigated thousands of abuse and neglect cases, helped remove children from dangerous situations and reunite families when safe. It was brutal, heartbreaking work, but it mattered. At least I thought it mattered until I opened that locked file cabinet and discovered my agency had deliberately buried cases involving powerful families, allowing children to remain in abusive situations rather than risk political complications. And when I tried to expose it, they destroyed me. The file cabinet haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why would old records be locked? Our retention policies required secure storage for active files, but archived materials were usually boxed and labeled for off-site storage. A locked cabinet in a basement suggested someone wanted to restrict access. On December 21st, I returned to the old office building during my lunch break. The moving crew was gone, the building mostly empty. I went to the basement storage room with bolt cutters I'd borrowed from maintenance, cut the padlock, and opened the cabinet. Inside were 47 case files dating from 2004 to 2011. Each file documented investigations of child abuse or neglect allegations that had been substantiated, meaning our investigators had found credible evidence of harm, but every single case had been marked as closed, services declined by family, or unsubstantiated upon secondary review. These closure codes were wrong. I read through the files in detail. These were serious cases. Children with documented injuries, medical evidence of abuse, witness testimonies, everything needed to move forward with protective custody or court intervention. Yet each case had been closed without action, and the families involved were not typical. These were names I recognized: state legislators, federal judges, prominent business owners, a Portland police captain, a district attorney. The cabinet contained cases involving children of powerful people, cases that had been buried to avoid political embarrassment or retaliation. One file involved the 7-year-old daughter of State Representative Douglas Carver, who'd been brought to an emergency room in 2008 with a spiral fracture of her arm and extensive bruising. The attending physician had documented injuries consistent with child abuse and filed a mandatory report with CPS. The investigation files showed our agency had conducted an initial assessment, interviewed the child, confirmed the physician's concerns. Then the case was closed 10 days later, marked as unfounded, with a note stating the injuries were consistent with an accidental fall. But the medical records clearly stated the injury pattern was inconsistent with the family's explanation. Another file involved Senator Helen Vargas's 12-year-old son, who'd been reported by a school counselor in 2010 for displaying sexualized behavior and making statements suggesting he'd been molested. Our investigator had interviewed the child and determined the allegations were credible. The case file included a recommendation for forensic interview and medical examination. Then the case was closed 3 days later with no forensic interview conducted, no follow-up, marked as services declined by family. Children don't get to decline protective services. That's not how the system works. I spent 4 hours in that basement reading through files, photographing every page with my phone. 47 cases. 47 children who'd been failed because their abusers were politically connected. This wasn't bureaucratic error. This was systematic corruption. Each file had a handwritten notation in red ink. Per director approval, close file. The director of our agency in those years was Marianne Holbrook, who'd retired in 2011. Someone at the highest level had personally approved burying these cases. On December 26th, the day after Christmas, I went to the State Child Welfare Program manager, a woman named Lisa Thornton who oversaw CPS operations statewide. I brought copies of the files and explained what I'd found. Thornton listened, examined several files, and her expression grew increasingly grim. "Brianna, this is deeply disturbing. If these files are authentic and these cases were improperly closed, we're looking at serious misconduct. I need to verify this with our records department and speak with legal counsel. Leave the files with me. I'll follow up after the holiday." I left the files with her, keeping digital copies for myself. I heard nothing for 2 weeks. On January 9th, 2013, I called Thornton to follow up. Her assistant said she was unavailable. I tried again January 10th, 11th, and 14th. She never returned my calls. On January 15th, I received an email summoning me to a meeting with my district supervisor, Amanda Fisher, and the agency's Human Resources Director, Kevin Nguyen. The meeting was scheduled for January 17th. At the meeting, I was confronted with allegations that I'd removed confidential case files from secure storage without authorization, violated client privacy, and acted outside my scope of authority. Kevin Nguyen was holding printouts of the photographs I'd taken in the basement. "Ms. McNally, these files were designated for destruction. They were sealed pending records disposal. You had no authorization to access them, photograph them, or share them with anyone. You've committed multiple policy violations and potentially criminal acts under state privacy laws." I was stunned. These files documented child abuse being covered up, and I was being accused of violating privacy. I explained that I'd discovered evidence of improper case closures involving influential families. Amanda Fisher cut me off. "Brianna, you accessed sealed archived files without authorization. Whatever you think you found, you obtained it illegally. Those cases were reviewed and closed appropriately by supervisors." You don't have the authority or the full context to second-guess those decisions. I insisted the files showed clear evidence of substantiated abuse cases being buried. Kevin Nguyen said my interpretation was mistaken and that I'd violated policy, regardless of my motivations. I was suspended without pay pending investigation, effective immediately. On February 1st, 2013, I was terminated for gross misconduct, violation of confidentiality policies, and insubordination. 19 years of service ended in a 10-minute meeting. I contacted an attorney, a man named Peter Sullivan, who specialized in whistleblower cases. He reviewed my documentation and agreed I had evidence of serious wrongdoing. He filed a wrongful termination lawsuit in March 2013, arguing I'd been fired in retaliation for exposing corruption. The case was dismissed in August 2013. The judge ruled that I'd obtained the files through unauthorized access, and therefore any evidence derived from them was inadmissible. My attorney explained this was a catch-22. I'd found evidence of misconduct, but because the misconduct was hidden in locked files I wasn't supposed to access, the evidence couldn't be used. Peter then tried a different approach. He filed complaints with the Oregon Department of Justice and the Federal Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, alleging that Oregon CPS had systematically failed to protect children in cases involving politically connected families. He provided copies of the files I'd photographed. Both agencies acknowledged receiving the complaints. Neither opened an investigation. The Oregon DOJ responded in October 2013, stating they'd reviewed the matter and found no evidence of criminal wrongdoing. HHS didn't respond at all. Meanwhile, I couldn't find work. No social services agency would hire me. I'd been fired for cause and labeled a privacy violator. I applied for dozens of positions outside social work. Background checks revealed my termination, and job offers evaporated. I filed for unemployment. My claim was denied because I'd been fired for misconduct. I appealed. The appeal was denied. I burned through my savings in 6 months. In 2014, I contacted every journalist and media outlet I could find, offering to share the files and tell my story. Most ignored me. 3 reporters showed initial interest, then stopped responding after they contacted Oregon CPS for comment. One reporter, Sophia Ramirez with Willamette Week, was honest with me. "Brianna, I believe you, but my editor says we can't publish this. Oregon CPS is threatening legal action if we publish confidential case files, even redacted ones. Our lawyers say we could face sanctions. I'm sorry." I tried going directly to the families involved, the ones whose children had been harmed. I thought maybe they'd want justice, want their stories told. I managed to contact 3 families. 2 refused to speak to me. The third, the family of the child injured in Representative Douglas Carver's home, initially agreed to talk, but then called me back and said their attorney advised against it. They'd reached a private settlement with the state and signed non-disclosure agreements. They couldn't discuss the case. I was trapped. I had evidence of corruption, but no way to make anyone act on it. The agencies responsible for oversight refused to investigate. The media wouldn't publish. The families were silenced by legal settlements. And I was unemployed, broke, and increasingly desperate. In 2015, I found work as an administrative assistant at a private company unrelated to social services. It paid half what I'd made as a social worker, but I needed income. I kept the files I'd photographed, stored them in multiple locations, hoped someday they'd matter. In 2017, Marianne Holbrook, the former CPS director who'd approved closing those cases, was appointed to a state commission on child welfare reform. The irony was sickening. The person who'd enabled abuse was now advising on child protection policy. Several of the politicians whose families were in those files have advanced their careers. Douglas Carver is now a U.S. congressman. Helen Vargas is a federal appellate judge. Their children's cases remain buried, sealed, forgotten. I check occasionally to see if any of those 47 children have appeared in news stories. Arrests, substance abuse, suicide. I've found 4 so far. 4 young adults who have failed as children and whose lives have been marked by trauma. I wonder about the other 43. I wonder what happened to them, whether they're surviving, whether anyone ever helped them. I'm 56 years old now. I still have the files, I still have the evidence, and it still means nothing because the people with power to act don't want to. Protecting children is supposed to be society's highest priority, but protecting powerful people is apparently higher. If you worked for Oregon Child Protective Services between 2004-2011, if you know anything about improperly closed cases or political interference in child welfare decisions, if you were one of the children in those buried files and want to tell your story, please find a way to come forward safely. Those 47 children deserved protection. They didn't get it. The least we can do is remember that someone noticed and tried. The wreckage was in the exact same position on December 28, 2007, as it had been on December 20th when I'd first spotted it during a routine training flight. Same location, same configuration, same debris pattern scattered across a remote section of Nevada desert 40 miles northwest of Las Vegas. But according to the National Transportation Safety Board, the crash I reported had occurred on December 27th, a full week after I'd first seen it. Someone was lying about when that plane went down, and the discrepancy meant the 4 people aboard had been alive days longer than anyone knew. Days when they could have been rescued if anyone had been searching. Days when they died slowly of exposure and injuries because their crash was deliberately not reported. My name is Gerald Voss, certified flight instructor with 34 years of experience and over 16,000 hours of flight time. I've trained hundreds of pilots at Desert Sky Aviation Academy outside Las Vegas. I know the terrain, I know the airspace, and I sure as hell know when I've seen a crash site. What I didn't know was how deep the corruption ran in aviation accident investigation, or how far powerful people would go to cover up their negligence. On December 20th, 2007, I was conducting a cross-country training flight with a student pilot, 19-year-old Tyler Nguyen, working on his commercial certificate. We departed Henderson Executive Airport at 9:15 a.m., practicing navigation and emergency procedures. At approximately 10:40 a.m., flying at 5,500 feet near the Sheep Mountain Range, Tyler spotted something unusual, metallic debris reflecting sunlight on the desert floor. I descended to investigate and clearly saw wreckage of a small aircraft scattered across approximately 300 meters of terrain. The impact had been severe. Pieces of white and blue fuselage, a separated wing section, scattered debris clearly visible from our altitude. I circled the site twice, documenting the location with GPS coordinates. 36.74222 degree Ian, 115.4891 degree DW. The wreckage appeared relatively fresh. No significant sand coverage. Metal still reflecting sunlight rather than dulled by weathering. I estimated the crash had occurred within the past few days, based on the condition of the debris. I radioed Las Vegas Approach Control at 10:47 a.m. and reported finding what appeared to be aircraft wreckage at the specified coordinates. Recommended emergency services be notified. The controller acknowledged my report and said they'd notify appropriate authorities. We continued our training flight and returned to Henderson at 12:30 p.m. I filed a detailed written report with the FAA Flight Standards District Office and called the NTSB Regional Office to ensure they'd received notification of the crash site. The NTSB representative I spoke with, a man named Carl Donovan, said they had no record of any aircraft being reported missing or overdue in that area. He took my information and said they'd investigate. I heard nothing for 5 days. On December 25th, Christmas Day, I called the NTSB again to follow up. Different person answered, a woman named Patricia Leeds. She checked their system and said no investigation had been opened because no aircraft was reported missing. She suggested I might have seen wreckage from an old crash. There were several historical accident sites in that region. I insisted the wreckage looked fresh, not historical. She said she'd make a note in their system. On December 27th, I was monitoring aviation news and saw a breaking story. A Cessna 210 with 4 people aboard was reported overdue. The aircraft had departed Santa Barbara, California, on December 26th at 11 a.m., destination Las Vegas, and had never arrived. The pilot was Richard Standish, wealthy real estate developer from California. His passengers were his wife, Valerie Standish, and another couple, Marcus and Judith Brenner. Civil Air Patrol had been activated to search. I immediately called the NTSB and said I'd found wreckage on December 20th. That might be their missing aircraft. The coordinates I'd reported matched the general area where the Cessna 210's last radar contact had been. On December 28th, search crews located the wreckage at coordinates 36.7422 degree, 1 degree, exactly where I'd reported it 8 days earlier. All 4 occupants were found deceased. The NTSB issued a press release stating the aircraft had been located following its disappearance on December 26th. But I knew that plane had been on the ground on December 20th, 6 days before its reported departure date. Something was very wrong. I reviewed my flight records and GPS logs from December 20th, confirming the coordinates and time I'd spotted the wreckage. I contacted Tyler Nguyen, my student pilot, to confirm his recollection. He clearly remembered seeing the wreckage on December 20th. I submitted a supplemental report to the NTSB on December 29th, explicitly stating I'd found the wreckage on December 20th, not December 27th. I explained this meant the aircraft had crashed at least 6 days earlier than their timeline indicated. On January 3, 2008, I received a call from NTSB investigator Patricia Leeds. She said they'd reviewed my supplemental report, and there appeared to be a misunderstanding. According to their investigation, the Cessna 210 had definitely departed Santa Barbara on December 26th and crashed shortly after. My sighting on December 20th must have been of different wreckage. I told her that was impossible. The coordinates matched exactly. She said coordinates could be misremembered or misrecorded. I said I had GPS logs and a witness. She said the witness was a student pilot whose reliability was questionable, and GPS logs could have errors. I was being told I hadn't seen what I'd clearly seen. I pushed back. I asked her to explain how I'd reported coordinates on December 20th that exactly matched where the Cessna 210 was found 8 days later. She said it was an unfortunate coincidence that there were old crash sites in that area, and I'd likely spotted one of those. The conversation was going nowhere. She ended by saying the NTSB's official timeline was that the aircraft crashed on December 27th, and nothing in my report changed that determination. I started investigating on my own. I obtained Richard Standish's flight plan filed on December 26th. Departure Santa Barbara at 11 a.m. Destination Henderson Executive Airport, Las Vegas. Estimated flight time 2 hours and 15 minutes. But when I contacted Santa Barbara Airport and requested records of Standish's actual departure, I found something interesting. The airport's security camera footage showed Standish's Cessna 210 had departed not on December 26th, but on December 19th at 3:45 p.m. I obtained a copy of the footage through a public records request. The aircraft had left California on December 19th, which meant it could have crashed on December 20th when I found it. The flight plan filed for December 26th was fake, filed after the crash to create a false timeline. But why? Why would someone falsify when the plane departed? I dug deeper into Richard Standish's background. He was a prominent developer involved in multiple large projects in Southern California and Nevada. He was also under federal investigation for land fraud and bribery related to a development deal in Las Vegas. The FBI had been building a case against him throughout 2007. Standish was scheduled to be deposed by federal prosecutors on December 23, 2007. He'd filed multiple motions to delay the deposition, all denied. The deposition was mandatory, and failure to appear would result in contempt charges and arrest. But if Standish's plane had crashed on December 20th, he was already dead when the deposition was scheduled for December 23rd. He didn't skip the deposition deliberately. He was deceased. However, if the official timeline showed he crashed on December 27th after the deposition date, then it appeared he'd intentionally fled or avoided legal proceedings. This timeline difference mattered enormously for legal and financial reasons, insurance policies, estate settlements, fraud case implications. Everything changed based on when Standish died. I discovered another relevant fact. Richard Standish's attorney was Lawrence Kellerman, a Las Vegas lawyer with a reputation for representing wealthy clients in complex litigation. Kellerman had filed the flight plan for December 26th on Standish's behalf, claiming Standish had asked him to file it before departure. But if Standish had actually departed December 19th, then Kellerman had filed a false flight plan to create a fraudulent timeline. I submitted all this information to the FBI on January 15, 2008. I included the Santa Barbara airport security footage, my GPS logs from December 20th, Tyler Nguyen's witness statement, and documentation of the falsified flight plan. I requested they investigate whether Standish's crash timeline had been deliberately misrepresented to affect the federal fraud case. An FBI agent named Michelle Torres contacted me on January 22nd. She said they'd received my submission and would review it. I never heard from her again. On February 8th, I called the FBI office to follow up. I was told Agent Torres had been reassigned and the matter had been referred back to the NTSB as an aviation issue, not a criminal matter. I called the NTSB and spoke to Patricia Leeds again. She was irritated. "Mr. Voss, we've addressed your concerns. Our investigation has concluded. The aircraft crashed on December 27th following departure from Santa Barbara on December 26th. Please stop submitting contradictory information." In March 2008, the NTSB issued its final accident report on the Cessna 210 crash. Probable cause: pilot error and spatial disorientation in night conditions. The report stated the aircraft departed Santa Barbara on December 26th and crashed December 27th in the early morning hours. My report of seeing wreckage on December 20th was noted in an appendix as witness statement inconsistent with established timeline, likely pertaining to separate wreckage site. The federal fraud case against Richard Standish was dismissed in April 2008, following his death. His estate settled civil claims related to the land fraud for an undisclosed amount, with no admission of wrongdoing. Standish's business partners, who would have been implicated by his testimony, faced no charges. The investigation collapsed without the key witness. But here's what the falsified timeline meant. Richard Standish, Valerie Standish, Marcus Brenner, and Judith Brenner crashed in the Nevada desert on December 20th, 2007. I reported finding wreckage that day. If search and rescue had been dispatched immediately, there's a possibility some or all of them could have survived. Crash survivability depends on many factors, but remote desert crashes often result in survivors who die of exposure days later waiting for rescue. By falsifying the timeline to show the crash occurred December 27th, any potential for rescue was eliminated. If anyone had survived the initial impact, they died waiting for help that never came because no one was looking. I couldn't let this go. In 2009, I contacted the families of Marcus and Judith Brenner. They had not been involved in Standish's legal troubles. They were simply friends who'd accepted a ride on his plane. They deserved to know their loved ones might have been saved. I met with Marcus Brenner's brother, Stephen Brenner. and shared all my documentation. He was horrified and angry. He hired an attorney to investigate. The attorney, a man named Raymond Joe, filed wrongful death claims against the estates of Richard Standish and Lawrence Kellerman, who died of a heart attack in 2008 conveniently. The claims alleged negligence and fraud related to the falsified timeline. The cases were settled out of court in 2011 for undisclosed amounts with non-disclosure agreements. Stephen Brenner told me before signing that he'd been advised taking the settlement was better than years of litigation he might lose. He took the money. The truth stayed buried. My career suffered. After I publicly questioned the NTSB's findings, students stopped requesting me as an instructor. Parents didn't want their children trained by someone known for conspiracy theories about crash investigations. My reputation in the aviation community was damaged. I retired from flight instruction in 2012, earlier than I'd planned. I'm 78 now, living on Social Security and a small pension. Richard Standish's fraud and bribery were never fully prosecuted. His business partners continued operating for years until separate legal issues caught up with some of them. Lawrence Kellerman died before facing any consequences for filing a false flight plan. The NTSB's false timeline remains official record, and 4 people died in a desert crash that could have triggered rescue operations on December 20th, but instead wasn't officially discovered until December 28th. I have copies of everything: the airport footage, my GPS logs, witness statements, the falsified flight plan. I've kept them for 16 years, hoping someone would eventually care. If you work in aviation accident investigation, if you have information about NTSB corruption or falsified reports, if you knew Richard Standish or Lawrence Kellerman and have information about their activities in December 2007, please find a way to share it. 4 people died, and someone made sure they'd never be rescued. That's not an accident. That's murder by negligence, and someone should answer for it. The account had received 3 deposits totaling $847,000 between June and August of 2014, all from a vendor listed as Mountain Ridge Construction Services. According to our procurement database, Mountain Ridge had been awarded contracts for school facility repairs across 6 different school districts in rural Montana. Standard infrastructure work, roof repairs, HVAC upgrades, parking lot resurfacing. The invoices were properly formatted, approved by the appropriate administrators, and paid through normal channels. Everything appeared legitimate until I ran the vendor verification check on December 19, 2014, and discovered Mountain Ridge Construction Services didn't exist. No business registration, no tax identification number, no physical address. The company was completely fictitious, which meant $847,000 of public education funding had been stolen, and someone in the state education department had approved the theft. My name is Simone Blackwell, formerly Senior Auditor for the Montana Office of Public Instruction, the state agency overseeing K-12 education funding. I'd worked in government auditing for 22 years, conducted hundreds of fiscal reviews, found plenty of waste and inefficiency, but never outright fraud of this magnitude. The Mountain Ridge case should have been my career achievement, exposing major embezzlement, recovering stolen funds, holding criminals accountable. Instead, it ended my career and made me persona non grata in Montana state government. I discovered the discrepancy during a routine annual audit of school district expenditures. My job was to verify that state education funds were being spent appropriately and that vendor payments matched actual services provided. The Mountain Ridge payments caught my attention because the amounts were significant and spread across multiple districts, which suggested either a very successful contractor or potentially fraudulent billing. I always investigated the successful ones. Real businesses don't mind verification, but fake ones fall apart under scrutiny. I started with the Montana Secretary of State Business Registry. Mountain Ridge Construction Services wasn't listed. I checked federal tax databases. No matching EIN, employer identification number. I searched for business licenses in the counties where the work had allegedly been performed. Nothing. I called the phone number listed on the invoices. Disconnected. The business address was a UPS store mailbox in Billings. I'd found a ghost company that had received nearly $1 million in public funds. Next, I contacted the school districts that had supposedly received services from Mountain Ridge. I spoke with maintenance supervisors and district business managers. None of them had any recollection of Mountain Ridge doing work. When I asked about specific projects listed on the invoices, roof repair at Jefferson Elementary, HVAC upgrade at Lincoln High School, the supervisors said those projects had either been completed by different contractors or hadn't been done at all. The invoices were completely fabricated, so how had the payments been approved? I traced the approval chain. Each invoice had been submitted to the State Office of Public Instruction for reimbursement under a grant program that provided funding for critical facility repairs. The invoices had been reviewed and approved by the program manager, a woman named Denise Thornton, who'd authorized payment from state funds directly to Mountain Ridge's bank account. I checked the other invoices Thornton had approved over the past 3 years. I found 8 additional fictitious vendors with total fraudulent payments exceeding $2.4 million. I documented everything in a detailed report submitted to my supervisor, Chief Auditor Warren Jeffries, on December 22, 2014. I recommended immediate criminal investigation and suspension of Denise Thornton pending review. Warren read the report, and his face went pale. "Simone, this is serious. Let me brief the superintendent immediately. Don't discuss this with anyone until we determine next steps." The superintendent of public instruction was Carolyn Vickers, an elected official who'd held the position since 2009. I heard nothing for 3 days. On December 26th, Warren called me at home. "Simone, Superintendent Vickers wants to meet with you Monday, December 29th. Be prepared to present your findings and recommendations." The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. I arrived with copies of my full audit report, supporting documentation, and a list of recommended actions including criminal referral to the Montana Attorney General. Superintendent Vickers was in the room along with Warren Jeffries and the agency's legal counsel, a man named Gregory Nash. I presented my findings for 45 minutes. The fake vendors, the fabricated invoices, the $2.4 million in fraudulent payments, Denise Thornton's role in approving everything. I showed them the evidence, business registry searches showing no such companies existed, school district confirmations that services were never provided, bank records showing where the money went. It was airtight. When I finished, Superintendent Vickers sat back and was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Ms. Blackwell, your audit work is thorough. However, I have concerns about jumping to conclusions about fraud. It's possible these are legitimate contractors operating under different business structures that weren't properly documented. It's possible the services were provided but not properly recorded at the district level. Before we make serious allegations that could damage reputations and trigger expensive investigations, I want an independent review of your findings." I was shocked. The evidence was clear. These were not legitimate businesses. I explained that I'd verified with multiple sources that the companies didn't exist and the work wasn't done. Vickers cut me off. "Ms. Blackwell, I understand your perspective, but we need to be absolutely certain before we involve law enforcement. I'm directing that this matter be reviewed by external auditors before any further action. In the meantime, I'm ordering you to not discuss your findings with anyone outside this room. This is an ongoing personnel matter subject to confidentiality." I was being silenced. I asked when the external review would occur. Vickers said she'd arrange it as soon as possible after the holidays. I left the meeting frustrated and suspicious. Why would the superintendent resist investigating clear evidence of fraud? I started researching Denise Thornton's background and connections. I discovered she'd worked on Carolyn Vickers' election campaign in 2008. She'd been hired to her current position in January 2009, shortly after Vickers took office. They had a personal relationship. That explained the reluctance to investigate. Vickers was protecting her friend. I also researched where the stolen money had gone. The bank account receiving payments for Mountain Ridge construction was registered to a shell company called Summit Holdings, LLC. Summit's ownership was obscured through multiple layers, but I managed to trace it through property records. Summit Holdings owned a vacation property in Whitefish, Montana, valued at approximately $1.2 million. The property was purchased in 2013. Public records showed the property's frequent guests included Denise Thornton and, interestingly, Carolyn Vickers. I added this information to my report, and on January 5, 2015, I submitted it directly to the Montana Attorney General's office, bypassing Superintendent Vickers. I met with an Assistant Attorney General named Philip Sorensen and presented all my findings. He listened carefully and agreed the evidence suggested criminal fraud. He said his office would open an investigation immediately. On January 8, 2015, I was called into Superintendent Vickers' office. She was furious. "Ms. Blackwell, you directly violated my order not to discuss your audit findings externally. You went to the Attorney General without authorization. This is gross insubordination. You're suspended without pay, effective immediately pending termination proceedings." I said I had a legal and ethical obligation to report suspected fraud. She said I had an obligation to follow the chain of command. I pointed out that the chain of command was compromised when the superintendent had a personal relationship with the suspect. She said my allegations were defamatory and baseless. Our legal counsel, Gregory Nash, handed me a letter formally suspending me and barring me from state facilities. The Attorney General's investigation proceeded despite my suspension. In February 2015, Denise Thornton was interviewed by investigators. She denied any wrongdoing, claimed she'd approved the invoices in good faith based on documentation provided to her, and suggested that if fraud occurred, it was perpetrated by outside parties without her knowledge. In March 2015, the Attorney General's office issued a report concluding that while irregularities existed in the vendor approval process, there was insufficient evidence to prove criminal intent by state employees. The report recommended improved oversight procedures, but no criminal charges. I was stunned. I'd provided clear evidence of fictitious vendors, fabricated invoices, and a money trail leading to property used by the suspects. How was that insufficient? I contacted Philip Sorensen for an explanation. He was apologetic but evasive. "Simone, proving criminal intent is difficult. Denise Thornton claims she was deceived by sophisticated fraudsters. Without direct evidence, she knew the vendors were fake. We can't prosecute. As for the Whitefish property, it's owned by a corporation with multiple investors. We can't prove Thornton or Vickers benefited personally." The investigation had been buried. My suspension was finalized as termination in April 2015 for insubordination and violation of confidentiality policies. 22 years of service ended because I'd reported fraud. I hired an attorney and filed a wrongful termination lawsuit. The case was dismissed in 2016. The judge ruled that I'd violated direct orders from my supervisor, regardless of my motivations, and my termination was within the agency's authority. I filed complaints with the Montana State Auditor and the U.S. Department of Education Office of Inspector General. Neither agency took action. The state auditor responded that the matter had been reviewed by the Attorney General and closed. The OIG said they had no jurisdiction over state-level financial management issues. Meanwhile, the story briefly appeared in local Montana media in mid-2015. A few newspapers ran articles about questions raised about education spending oversight, but the coverage was superficial and died quickly. No major investigative journalism, no public outcry, no pressure for accountability. Carolyn Vickers ran for re-election as Superintendent of Public Instruction in 2016 and won. Denise Thornton remained employed in the Office of Public Instruction until she retired in 2018 with full benefits. The $2.4 million was never recovered. The fake vendors were never identified. Likely they were simply bank accounts controlled by Thornton or her associates, but without cooperation from financial institutions and subpoena power. I couldn't prove it. The school districts that were supposed to receive facility improvements never got them. Schools in rural Montana continued operating with deteriorating roofs and failing HVAC systems while the money meant to fix those problems sat in someone's pocket. I couldn't find another auditing job. My reputation was destroyed. I was labeled a whistleblower who'd violated confidentiality and defied supervisors. I eventually found work doing bookkeeping for a small business in Missoula. I'm 67 now, retired, living on a reduced Social Security pension because my state service time doesn't count fully after my termination. I still have all my audit documentation. I've kept it for 10 years, hoping someone would eventually care enough to act on it. I check property records occasionally. The Whitefish Vacation Home is still owned by Summit Holdings, LLC. I check election records. Carolyn Vickers served as superintendent until 2021, then was appointed to a state board position. She's done quite well for herself. If you worked for Montana Office of Public Instruction between 2009 to 2015, if you have information about vendor fraud or financial mismanagement, if you know anything about Denise Thornton or Carolyn Vickers and their financial dealings, please find a way to share it safely. $2.4 million was stolen from children's education. The thieves were never punished. I was. That's not how the system is supposed to work, but apparently it's how it does. The man outside was wearing a Santa suit, but his face was wrong. I realized this at 11:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve 2017, watching from my bedroom window in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. He was standing on the sidewalk across the street, perfectly still, staring at our house. Not in a jolly, waving at kids way. Staring like he was studying the layout, counting windows, looking for entry points. My wife, Rachel, was already asleep. My two daughters, Emily and Sophie, were in their rooms dreaming of Christmas morning. And this man in a Santa suit was watching our house like he was planning something terrible. I'm Jason Kurtz, and I used to think I understood how the world worked. Bad things happen to other people, far away. Evil was something you saw on the news, abstract and distant. Then I watched a man in a Santa suit standing outside our house on Christmas Eve, and 15 minutes later, our home alarm system triggered. Someone tried to break into our house while my family slept. And when I reported it, when I discovered that 15 other homes in our neighborhood had been targeted the same night by men dressed as Santa, when I found out the Columbus Police Department knew about it and had done nothing, my entire understanding of safety and justice collapsed. The alarm company called my cell at 12:03 a.m. Christmas Day. "Mr. Kurtz, your rear door contact has triggered. Should we dispatch police?" I was already moving, grabbing the baseball bat I kept in the closet, heading downstairs. I told them yes, dispatch immediately. I could hear someone at the back door, the handle rattling. A scraping sound like tools on the lock. I turned on every light in the house, started yelling that police were coming, that I was armed. The noise at the door stopped. When I looked out the window, I saw a figure running across our backyard, wearing a Santa suit. Police arrived 12 minutes later. Officers Daniel Brooks and Michelle Carver took my statement, examined the back door, found tool marks on the lock consistent with attempted forced entry. I told them about the man I'd seen watching our house earlier, wearing a Santa suit. Officer Carver exchanged a look with Officer Brooks. "Mr. Kurtz, you're the fourth call tonight about someone in a Santa suit attempting break-ins." "Same thing. Someone dressed as Santa, watching houses, then attempting entry." 4 calls. 4 houses targeted. On Christmas Eve. By someone dressed as Santa Claus. Officer Brooks said they were investigating, that I should keep my alarm system active, that they'd increase patrols in the area. They left at 1:15 a.m. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the living room with my bat, watching the windows, listening for sounds. My family never knew. They woke up Christmas morning excited about presents, unaware that someone had tried to break into our home while they slept. On December 26th, I called the Columbus Police non-emergency line to follow up on the investigation. The dispatcher said my case number was logged and an officer would contact me if they had updates. I asked how many total incidents there had been Christmas Eve. She said she couldn't provide that information, but I could file a public records request. I did, that same day. I also did something else. I posted in our neighborhood's private Facebook group describing what had happened and asking if anyone else had experienced similar incidents. The response was overwhelming. Within 4 hours, I had messages from 14 other families in our neighborhood reporting the same thing. Someone dressed as Santa watching their house Christmas Eve, followed by attempted break-ins or suspicious activity. 15 families total, including mine, all targeted the same night. I compiled all the information, addresses, times, descriptions, photos several people had managed to take of the Santa figure. The descriptions were consistent. White male, approximately 6 feet tall, average build, full Santa costume including beard and hat. But the faces people described were wrong. The beard looked fake. The expression beneath it wasn't jolly, and several people mentioned the eyes seemed cold and calculating. One neighbor, a man named Paul Henderson, had gotten a particularly clear photo showing the Santa figure standing under a streetlight. You could see the eyes clearly. They weren't friendly. They were predatory. I took all this compiled information to the Columbus Police Department on December 27th and requested to speak with a detective. I met with Detective Laura Finnegan, showed her everything I'd gathered. She looked through it and seemed genuinely concerned. "Mr. Kurtz, this is disturbing. 15 attempted break-ins is a significant pattern. I'll make sure this gets priority investigation." She took copies of everything and promised to follow up. I heard nothing for 2 weeks. On January 10th, 2018, I called Detective Finnegan. She said the investigation was ongoing but had no updates to share. I asked if they'd identified any suspects. She said they were pursuing leads. I asked what leads. She said she couldn't discuss details of an active investigation. Frustrated, I called the local news stations. Maybe media attention would generate tips or pressure police to take it seriously. A reporter from NBC4 Columbus, a woman named Ashley Brennan, contacted me on January 12th. She interviewed me and several other affected neighbors. She visited the neighborhood, filmed the houses that had been targeted, created a compelling story about a serial break-in pattern on Christmas Eve. The story aired on January 15th. The response was significant. More people called the station reporting similar incidents not just in our neighborhood, but across Columbus. By January 18th, Ashley had confirmed at least 37 incidents of men in Santa suits watching houses or attempting break-ins on Christmas Eve 2017 across Franklin County. This was major. 36 coordinated break-in attempts across a major metropolitan area, all using the same disguise, all on Christmas Eve. Ashley kept investigating. On January 22nd, she called me with disturbing news. "Jason, I've been digging through police records and talking to sources in the department. Columbus police knew about the Santa break-in pattern before Christmas Eve. They'd received intelligence about a planned series of burglaries targeting suburban homes on Christmas Eve, with suspects planning to use Santa costumes as disguise. They didn't issue any public warning. They didn't increase patrols. They just let it happen. I was furious. Police had advance knowledge and did nothing? Ashley explained she'd obtained internal police memos dated December 20th and December 21st, discussing credible intelligence about organized burglary crew planning holiday operation. The memos recommended increased patrols and community warnings. But according to Ashley's sources, Police Chief Theodore Lawson had decided against publicizing the threat, concerned it would create unnecessary panic and look bad for the department. Instead, they'd planned to quietly increase presence Christmas Eve. Except they hadn't actually increased presence enough to prevent 36 break-in attempts. Ashley's follow-up story aired January 24th, exposing that Columbus police had prior knowledge of the threat and failed to warn the public. The community reaction was intense. People were outraged. How could police know about a coordinated criminal operation and not warn residents? Chief Lawson held a press conference on January 25th. He denied that police had specific knowledge about Christmas Eve break-ins, claimed the intelligence had been vague and uncorroborated, and insisted the department had responded appropriately. But Ashley had the memos. She'd published excerpts. The intelligence hadn't been vague. It specifically mentioned Christmas Eve, suburban neighborhoods, and Santa disguises. Lawson was lying. On January 28th, Columbus City Council held an emergency meeting to discuss the police department's handling of the Christmas Eve incidents. I attended and spoke during public comment, explaining how my family had been targeted and how police had done nothing to prevent it despite having advance warning. Other affected residents spoke as well. The council members seemed genuinely shocked. Council President Andrew Martins promised a full investigation into the police department's response. An independent review board was established to examine what went wrong. I was hopeful. Finally, accountability. The review board began its work in February 2018, interviewing police officials, reviewing internal communications, examining department policies. Their report was released in April 2018. It concluded that Columbus Police Department had received intelligence about possible criminal activity on Christmas Eve, but had appropriately balanced public safety concerns with the need to avoid creating panic. The report recommended improved communication protocols, but found no misconduct. The review was a whitewash. I obtained the full report and read it carefully. The review board had been staffed with 2 retired police officers and 1 city attorney, hardly independent. They'd accepted Chief Lawson's explanations without serious scrutiny. They'd dismissed the memos Ashley Brennan had published as routine information sharing, rather than actionable intelligence. The whole process had been designed to protect the police department's reputation, not find truth. Meanwhile, the actual burglars were never caught. Detective Finnegan had told me in March that the investigation was ongoing, but by May 2018, it was clear they had no leads. None of the 15 families in my neighborhood ever recovered stolen property or saw anyone arrested. The 37 confirmed incidents across Franklin County remained unsolved. The men in Santa suits had gotten away with it. I started wondering why. Why would organized burglars specifically target Christmas Eve? Why use Santa costumes? Ashley Brennan and I discussed this several times. Her theory was that Christmas Eve provided perfect conditions. Families distracted with celebrations, houses full of new gifts and electronics, neighborhoods quiet with people focused on private gatherings. And anyone seeing someone in a Santa suit would think twice before calling police because it might just be a neighbor doing something festive. The costumes were brilliant cover, sinister enough to blend in on Christmas Eve. But the advance intelligence police had received suggested something more organized. Ashley kept digging. In June 2018, she found a connection. One of the men arrested in an unrelated burglary case in Cleveland had mentioned during questioning that his crew had contracted out for holiday operations. He wouldn't elaborate, but it suggested professional criminal networks that specialized in specific, high-value operations. Ashley theorized the Columbus Christmas Eve break-ins might have been conducted by a professional crew brought in from out of state specifically for that operation. If true, it meant Columbus police had intelligence about professional criminals planning a major operation and had failed to prevent it or apprehend anyone afterward. Ashley tried to get police to confirm whether their intelligence had indicated professional crews. They refused to comment. The story died. By August 2018, no one was talking about the Christmas Eve break-ins anymore. It was old news. But I hadn't forgotten. In December 2018, approaching the one-year anniversary, I contacted Detective Finnegan again to ask about the case status. She said it remained open but inactive due to lack of leads. I asked if there were plans for increased security Christmas Eve 2018 to prevent a repeat. She said she couldn't comment on operational plans. I took that as a no. I organized a neighborhood watch for Christmas Eve 2018. 15 families participated, coordinating to have someone awake and watching every hour overnight. We shared phone numbers, agreed to call police immediately if anyone suspicious appeared. Our neighborhood had no incidents Christmas Eve 2018, but 3 neighborhoods within 5 miles of us did. Reports of men in Santa suits watching houses, though only 2 confirmed attempted break-ins. The pattern continued, just in different locations. I reported this to Ashley Brennan. She did a brief follow-up story in January 2019, but it got minimal attention. The public had moved on. Columbus police issued a statement that they were investigating the new incidents and there was no confirmed connection to the 2017 Christmas Eve pattern. But I knew better. Same costumes, same timing, same methodology. The burglars had returned. In 2019, I filed a civil lawsuit against the City of Columbus and the Columbus Police Department for negligence, arguing they'd failed to protect the public despite having advance knowledge of a threat. The case was dismissed in March 2020. The judge ruled that police have no specific constitutional duty to protect individual citizens, only a general duty to the public. Their failure to warn us or prevent the break-ins, while perhaps poor judgment, didn't constitute legal liability. I appealed. The appeal was denied in September 2020. I've spent over $40,000 in legal fees pursuing accountability. I've gotten nothing except stress, frustration, and the knowledge that the system doesn't care. My family is fine. No one was hurt. Nothing irreplaceable was taken. But I can't stop thinking about what could have happened. If that man in the Santa suit had gotten inside our house, if he'd encountered my daughters, if he'd been armed and violent, we were lucky. 36 families were lucky. But we shouldn't have had to be lucky. Police should have protected us. It's December 2024 now, 7 years since that Christmas Eve. The men in Santa suits have never been caught. I check crime reports every January, looking for similar patterns. Columbus has had scattered incidents over the years, a few attempted break-ins around holidays, occasional reports of suspicious people in costume. Nothing as organized as Christmas Eve 2017, but enough to suggest the problem never went away. If you live in Columbus, Ohio, if you experienced a similar incident on Christmas Eve in any year, if you have information about organized burglary crews operating during holidays, if you know anything about the police department's handling of criminal intelligence, please come forward. Use anonymous tip lines. Protect yourself, but share what you know. Because 37 families were targeted 7 years ago, police knew it was coming, and no one was ever held accountable. That's not acceptable.